This book in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is All Politics is Local, Why Progressives Must Fight for the States by Megan Winter. And this is from the introduction. On February 2018, 6 days after 17 people were shot and killed at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, Representative Keion McGee, a Democrat from Miami, stood on the floor of the Florida House of Representatives. Looking on from the gallery above were Parkland students who had traveled over 400 miles by bus to Tallahassee with the hope of persuading their state lawmakers to pass gun reforms in Florida. McGee asked the Assembly to vote on a bill that would have banned assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith of Orlando, where a gunman had killed 49 and wounded another 53 people in the Pulse nightclub in 2016, had sponsored the bill, whose chances would expire unless the House bent its usual protocol and acted right at that moment. The shooting at Parkland demands extraordinary action, McGee told the Assembly. He was trying a technical procedural maneuver, one that might have worked in an alternate reality without partisan politics. But everyone who understood what it meant that Republicans held a supermajority in the Florida Assembly knew what would come next. Richard Corcoran, the Republican Speaker of the House, interrupted McGee. A few minutes later, the House voted on a party lines, 71-36, not to consider the assault weapons ban. In the gallery, students began to cry. On Twitter, student leader Emma Gonzalez wrote, "The anger that I feel right now is indescribable." Something unusual was happening. With their eloquence, temerity, and rage, the Parkland students had seized national attention. Major news networks and papers dispatched reporters to cover their calls for change. That week in February, even before knowing that hundreds of thousands of students nationwide would soon walk out of their schools and through the streets, the American public paid attention to what was happening in Tallahassee, Florida. And yet, from another advantage, the scene in the Florida Capitol that day was not at all unusual. In state houses, it is not uncommon to watch someone sit before a panel of elected officials, hold up a placard of a dead child killed by opioids or lack of insurance or a gun, and plead for the passage of a bill that will inevitably not move out of committee because it does not fit within the political calculus of the Assembly's leadership. In those hearing rooms, ordinary people often share in breathtaking impotence. 3 weeks before the Parkland students arrived in Tallahassee, for example, the Florida Senate Judiciary Committee discussed the Rule of Law Adherence Act, which would have required all local government officials, explicitly including employees of the state university system, to turn over information about immigrants to federal immigration officials. The bill was similar to those shopped around the country by the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, an organization that since the 1970s has written experimental conservative state legislation. ALEC's corporate members included GEO Group, the largest provider of detention services for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and a major donor to Florida Republicans in Donald Trump's presidential campaign. In 2016, the federal government decided to stop contracting with private prisons because the Department of Justice investigation had found they were unsafe. But after Trump's inauguration in early 2017, GEO Group received $774 million worth of contracts to run federal prisons. On January 30th, 2018, the day that the Florida immigration bill was considered in Tallahassee, so many people showed up that the hearing room reached capacity. Muslim students and Latino farm workers and their teenage children who had traveled hours to testify against the bill were not allowed into the packed room. Expressionless, they watched the proceedings on a television mounted in a hallway as Florida Senator Aaron Bean stood at the podium and said that his bill means criminals will be kept off the streets. The bill did not advance in what counts as a victory, in part because in 2011, immigrant rights groups staged weeks-long protests in Tallahassee to oppose a bill modeled after Arizona's 2010 law that allowed police officers to ask for immigration papers if they suspected someone was undocumented. The Florida legislature didn't pass a new aggressive anti-immigration law until 2019, when it gave the state the power to sue local law enforcement that refused to detain people according to orders from federal immigration officials. The next day, January 31st, Floridians concerned about sea level rise arrived in Tallahassee by the busload to ask their legislators to pass a raft of proactive climate change bills. Many were college students or recent graduates who had grown up along the coast and understood that the window of opportunity for stalling climate change was rapidly closing. During their lifetimes, they told me, their hometowns would be radically altered, if not sunken. By the end of the legislative session that March, None of the bills they wanted were passed, even though just 10 years ago it was all but mandatory for both Democrats and Republicans in Florida to at least make overtures about the need for proactive environmental laws. Similar scenes play out in hearing rooms across the country, usually unrecognized by the American public. Beneath the tumult of the Trump presidency, state lawmakers have largely kept their course. As Alec's own website explained in 2017, quote, state legislatures around the country have made significant progress, passing bills on issues such as immigration, policing, and health care, even as Republicans in Congress and President Trump have struggled to make similar progress at the federal level, end of quote. After decades of state-based campaigns coordinated by Libertarian and Republican operatives and disinvestment in the states, right-wing politicians have swept control of state houses. All politics is local. So every 5 years, the U.S. Department of Agriculture comes out with new guidelines, and we just put up a video over at ThomHartmann.com for supporters of our program that talks about how the Trump administration, in this insanely corrupt deal with the $100 billion industry of ultra-processed, high-sugar, high-salt, high-fat foods that is literally killing 700,000 Americans a year, has said, oh, we're going to change the guidelines so that these fast food, high-processed food companies can shovel their stuff into our school lunch programs, into our kids. We're going to change the guidelines so people aren't informed about the importance of, you know, dialing back somewhat on meat and on salt and sugar and all these other things. It's nuts. You can check the whole thing out over at ThomHartmann.com. Look for the video for our, you know, the supporters of our program at ThomHartmann.com.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Happy Tuesday. Thom Hartmann here with you. Boy, a lot going on. The former Dallas police officer who shot dead her unarmed neighbor. She walked into his apartment thinking it was her apartment. And she's white, he was black. She saw a black man in what she thought was her apartment, and she pulled her gun and shot him dead. Without even a conversation. He was completely unarmed. She was just found guilty of murder. I think we're beginning a bit of a tipping point here in the United States in terms of holding cops accountable for crimes that they commit. That's a good start. Mike Pompeo says that the 5 State Department officials who have been subpoenaed by the House Intelligence Committee, who are looking into, you know, what's up here. Pompeo is running around the world apparently trying to find dirt on Robert Mueller and the FBI. Seriously. I mean, think about that for a minute. The Secretary of State is trying to find dirt on the FBI, which works for the Department of Homeland Security. This is getting bizarre. But anyhow, he says that he's not going to let his people testify before Congress. Sorry, you can't talk to them. This is mind-boggling. Chuck Grassley, on the other hand, Chuck Grassley is saying that you know, he wants that these people should, you know, be speaking, that the whistleblowers should be speaking to the Senate Intelligence Committee as well as the House Intelligence Committee. He wants to know what they have to say. It looks to me like the Republican Party is essentially starting to disintegrate. The modern Republican Party came into being in the 1980s with the help of big money as a result of the 1976 and 78 Buckley and First National Bank Supreme Court decisions. The Supreme Court essentially created the modern Republican Party by saying big money can own politics. And the Democrats were still largely, you know, basically owned by, for, you know, to use the same language, labor unions, right? The Democrats, by and large, at that point, still were in bed with labor. I mean, labor still existed. It was about a third of Americans were unionized when Reagan came into office. So the Republicans said, okay, cool, we'll take your money. We'll get in bed with you. Koch brothers and Richard Mellon Scaife and Joe Coors and all these guys, and, you know, who had started in the 70s as a result of the Powell memo. And then Lewis Powell, of course, authored the 1978 First National Bank versus Buckley decision, which said that corporations can now own politicians. 2 years earlier, in the Buckley decision, the Supreme Court said that individual billionaires can own politicians. So this is where we're at. So it seems to me like the modern Republican Party is falling apart, for lack of a better word. I mean, it's just disintegrating. Meanwhile, Bill Barr is running around the world, also apparently trying to find dirt on to discredit the FBI, CIA, NSA, Department of Defense, military intelligence, 17 different intelligence agencies all said, yeah, the Russians were involved in our election. And Trump doesn't like that because it suggests that he's president because the Russians helped him out. And he's trying to discredit it. And he's got Barr and Pompeo doing this. Barr was in Italy over the weekend. In fact, apparently he's there now, or he's in Spain now, I guess. So I just wanted to share with you a couple of pages. This is really well timed. My book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, is out today. If you pre-ordered a copy, it'll probably arrive in the mail today. If you ordered it from Amazon or Powell's or ABE or any of the other great online sellers out there. And it's in bookstores as of today. And this is from page 118. And I'm just going to read a little bit of this to you, or share a little bit of this with you, and offer you commentary, because I think it's so relevant to what's going on right now. During the week of Christmas, 1992, George H.W. Bush was on his way out of office. Bill Clinton had won the White House the month before, and in a few weeks would be sworn in as president. But George Bush's biggest concern, this is George Bush the elder, he was president for a couple more weeks. His biggest concern wasn't that he'd have to leave the White House to retire back to Connecticut, Maine, or Texas, where he had mansions, but rather that he might end up in a federal prison. Because independent counsel Lawrence Walsh was closing in on him fast, and George Bush's diary was the key to it all. Walsh had been appointed independent counsel in '86 to investigate the Iran-Contra crimes of the Reagan administration. Did the plot start in the spring of 1980 during the Reagan-Carter election as a way of having the Iranians hold the hostages long enough to humiliate Carter and cost him the election? Did Bill Casey do it all by himself as campaign manager? Or, as with Nixon in '68, did the presidential candidate or his former CIA chief turned vice presidential candidate participate? Or was the Iran-Contra conspiracy limited, as Reagan and Bush insisted, and Reagan confessed on TV? In later years of the Reagan presidency, was it limited to a response to hostage-taking in Lebanon? Who knew? What? And when? Walsh, the special prosecutor, had zeroed in on documents that were in the possession of Reagan's former defense secretary, Caspar Weinberger, who all the evidence showed was definitely in on the deal, and Bush's diary that could corroborate it, which is why Walsh had subpoenaed Bush's diary. Weinberger was preparing to testify that Bush knew about it and even participated. And Walsh had already, based on information he'd obtained from the investigation into Weinberger, demanded that Bush turn over his diary from the campaign. Bush was panicked, and he only had 3 more weeks of safety in office. Is this starting to sound familiar? Is this starting to sound sort of like Trump right now? So Bush called in his Attorney General, William Barr. Keep in mind, this is December of 1992. Bush called in his Attorney General, William Barr, and asked his advice. Barr, along with Bush, was already in trouble. The iconic New York Times writer William Safire referred to him not as Attorney General Barr, but instead as Cover-Up General Barr, noting that in another scandal having to do with Bush selling weapons of mass destruction to Saddam Hussein, Barr was already trying to cover up for Bush himself and his friends. On October 19, 1992, William Safire wrote of Bill Barr's unwillingness to appoint an independent counsel to look into what was then called Iraq-gate. And this is a quote from William Safire's column. Why does the cover-up general resist independent investigation? Because he knows where it may lead. To Dick Thornburg, James Baker, Clayton Uter, Brent Scowcroft, and himself, William Barr. He vainly hopes to be able to head it off, or at least be able to use the threat of firing to negotiate a deal. End of quote. Now, just 2 short months later, Bush was asking Barr for advice on how to avoid another very serious charge in the Iran-Contra crimes. How, he wanted to know, could they shut down Walsh's investigation before Walsh's lawyers got their hands on Bush's diary? In April 2001, safely distant from the swirl of D.C. politics, the University of Virginia's Miller Center was compiling oral presidential histories and interviewed Barr about his time as AG in the Bush White House. They brought up the issue of the Weinberger pardon and Barr's involvement in it. Turns out Barr was right in the middle of it. This is what Barr told the Miller Center at the University of Virginia back in 2001. He said, quote, "There were some people arguing just for a pardon for Weinberger, and I said, no, in for a penny, in for a pound. I went over and told the president I thought he should not only pardon Caspar Weinberger, but while he was at it, he should pardon about 5 other people." End of quote, which is exactly what Bush did on Christmas Eve when most Americans weren't checking the news. The holiday notwithstanding, the result was explosive. America knew that both Reagan and Bush were up to their necks in the Iran-Contra crimes, and both could be facing prison time as a result. The independent counsel had already obtained 1 conviction and 3 guilty pleas, and 2 other individuals were lined up for prosecution. And Walsh was closing in fast on George Herbert Walker Bush himself. So when Barr and Bush shut down the investigation by pardoning not only Weinberger, but also the 5 others involved in the crime, destroying Walsh's ability to prosecute anybody and wiping out his leverage to get Bush's diaries, the New York Times ran the headline all the way across 4 of the 6 columns on the front page, screaming in all caps, "Bush pardons 6 in Iran affair, aborting a Weinberger trial, prosecutor assails cover-up." Bill Barr had struck, saving the political life of a Republican president. So the future Republican presidential nominees, Joyce, can you grab this, please? So the future Republican nominees wouldn't suffer under the cloud of Reagan's and Bush's crimes. The second paragraph of the Times story by David Johnson laid it out. Answer it, Joyce, please, right now. Mr. Weinberger was scheduled to stand trial on January 5th on charges that he lied to Congress about his knowledge of the arms sales to Iran and efforts by other countries to help underwrite the Nicaraguan rebels, a case that was expected to focus on Mr. Weinberger's private notes that contained references to Mr. Bush's endorsement of the secret shipments to Iran. When a Republican president is in serious legal trouble, Bill Barr is the go-to guy. And it goes on for another page and a half about basically how Bill Barr broke the law, shut down the investigation. This was in 1992. I document all this in my new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, because it has to do with the Supreme Court and the packing of the court by Republican presidents. And it's pretty amazing stuff. But that's, Bill Barr is up to this. Pompeo is up to this. And now now Pompeo has also ordered the State Department, the prosecutors inside the State Department, to go back to people who sent emails to Hillary Clinton, which she had on her home server, and say, we have retroactively classified these emails as top secret, and therefore, you may have committed a crime, or you may be a witness to Hillary Clinton committing a crime. So here they are. I mean, literally as we speak, Mike Pompeo and the State Department are trying to get Hillary Clinton indicted for having secure information on her server. At the same time, by the way, that up until very recently, and maybe continuing, but up until this last year, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump were conducting government business on their own private servers. Is this starting to sound weird? Well, it is. Surprise, surprise. So we've got that going on. Kurt Eichenwald, the New York Times reporter, is going to be stopping by at the top of the next hour to lay out for the whole Hunter Biden thing. Turns out the former director of the CIA, Cofer Black, and another a European official, and Hunter Biden were apparently all put on the board of this gas company to try to clean up the corruption. The whole thing is getting very, very strange. And meanwhile, Trump is lying about what's going on so badly that the Inspector General for the intelligence community, the chief cop for the intelligence community, has come out and said, nah, this is just, basically Trump is lying to you. We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
This is getting all very, very strange. Stick around. And welcome back, Tim at Aloha, Oregon. Hey, Tim, what's up?
Yeah. Tom, it's getting to the point where I try to get a good breakdown of what's happening in the news and stuff. This is amazing stuff. I just don't understand why this isn't being given to kids in school. I have friends who are teachers and stuff, and nothing's being put in historical context anymore. You know?
Right.
Yesterday is gone and tomorrow doesn't exist. What they're doing is they're manipulating the legal and political system. As long as they continue to do that and McConnell can be in control of the Senate, they're going to continue this stuff. You know, no matter how many subpoenas or whatever they issue, people have to understand that, you know.
Yeah,
it's
this
scary stuff.
Yeah, this is and I mean the essence of the problem, Tim, is that the more crimes Trump gets away with, the more crimes he commits. You know,
absolutely.
And the Mueller investigation is like, you know, what is it? Evidence number one. I mean, you know, the fact that
but with the Mueller investigation, according to his base, it vindicated him.
That's
so
what I mean.
Basically, throw that.
That's what I mean. I mean, you know, what came out of the Mueller investigation was absolutely nothing. Even the Democrats, I mean, after Bill Barr came out and lied about what was in the report, that became the narrative, and the Democrats were like, "Oh, damn, you know, we weren't able to nail this guy." And you know, the consequence of that is that Trump was like, "Hey, I'm vindicated. I'm completely exonerated." You know, none of which is true. No collusion. I mean, literally none of that stuff is true. But the big lie that Trump and Barr told has stuck, not just with Trump's base, Tim, but with probably more than half of, you know, Americans who are only marginally informed.
Yeah, well, you know, putting this in historical context, you can look at the turn of the century before McKinley was assassinated. He was described as a financial conservative. He had the Mellons and the Rockefellers in charge of this country.
Yep.
No child labor laws, no state national parks, no income tax, no women couldn't vote. You see what I mean? I want to go back to that, basically.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
It would be their ideal ideology if they could do it.
Yeah, and this is not, by the way...
And it's unfortunate that people in this country don't understand that, you know. I lived in the same neighborhood for 30 years, and I talked to my neighbors and people who run businesses around here, and so many of them are apathetic about this because they think everybody's the same. Yeah. You know, and it isn't. It doesn't work out that way. You need to take your book to go to one of Trump's next rallies and read some of that to his.
Good luck with that.
Yeah,
I value my life.
That's why I knew I'd get a laugh from you. But you see what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah,
keep up the good work. Huh?
Thanks a lot. Well, Tim, the point that I wanted to make before you go is that this is, you know, your friends probably think that they're conservatives. My dad was a conservative, a real conservative, an old-fashioned conservative, and he was all in favor of moving forward as a country. He just thought that we should do it slowly and carefully. That was what. You know, William F. Buckley said, a conservative is a man who stands astride the arc of history with his hand up shouting, stop, or at least slow down. And, you know, yes, let's move in a positive direction, but let's do so carefully and incrementally so as not to disrupt society. That was the definition of conservatism up until 1980. And in 1980, the conservative movement got hijacked by a bunch of right-wing billionaires who don't believe in democracy. They believe in autocracy. They believe in plutocracy. And that you know, conservatism has come to be redefined as that. And that has nothing to do with, you know, classic conservatism going all the way back to Sir Edmund Burke. So.
And no matter how much they make, it's never enough.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. Yeah. These hoarders. Yes. Thank you. Tim, thanks a lot for the call. We'll be right back. Do we have our server back up? And welcome back. Just a heads up, Kurt Eichenwald, I had teased that he would be here at the top of the next hour. He'll actually be here in about 10 minutes. So stick around. It should be interesting. In fact, it will be interesting. I guarantee it. So here we have the Secretary of State running around the world trying to get proof that Russia didn't actually involve itself in our elections. And, be it, hacking voting machines, or be it, running operations out of the Internet Research Agency, I believe it's called, or Bureau, agency, that was, we're putting up these Facebook memes and all this social media stuff. We've got the Attorney General trying to find dirt on We've got the president talking to the prime minister of Australia. It is like we have fully fallen through the looking glass. We have stepped into totally bizarro territory. The New York Times has this incredible story that Bill Barr set up this conversation between Trump and the Prime Minister of Australia, Mr. Morrison, asking him to help debunk the Mueller probe. I mean, this goes beyond the whistleblower. This goes beyond Ukraine. This is, whose water are these guys carrying? At one level, it kind of looks like, it's Donald Trump being offended by the fact that people think that Russia put him in the White House, and he wants to, he's already said his crowd sizes were bigger than anybody's, and he got more votes than anybody because that 3 million vote surplus that Hillary Clinton had was actually Mexicans voting in the American election who aren't citizens, and it was 5 million. It wasn't 3 million. Trump goes off on this stuff at his rallies, and people are like, yeah. But I suspect this is a lot deeper than just Donald Trump. Prior to the 1980s, I think you can track this back to 1976 in the Buckley versus Vallejo decision, and 1978, the First National Bank of Boston versus Frank Bellotti decision. In those two decisions, for the first time in the history of the United States, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that money is the same thing as speech, and therefore the use of money in owning and influencing politicians, in getting politicians elected, in promoting the passage of legislation, both through the political process and through the public, through the public domain, that all of that is protected First Amendment free speech, and basically threw out a whole bunch of laws. I'm going back all the way back to 1907. But in particular, the laws that have been passed right after the Nixon bribery scandals, and people forget that a lot of what Watergate had to do with at the end really had to do with Nixon being bribed, not just by the milk lobby. But after the Nixon bribery scandals, Congress passed, a bunch of clean government laws. And the Supreme Court struck down the most important of those in 76 and 78. 76 saying individual billionaires can own politicians, and 78 saying, well, we're going to extend this logic to corporations too. And what that did is that, combined with the Powell memo, brought the billionaires into the political process in 79, which brought Ronald Reagan into the White House in 1981, in the election of 1980, which completely changed the conservative movement from the old William F. Buckley, hey, let's just go slow, but let's go forward, to this new conservative movement, which is we're all about the plutocrats. It's amazing. We'll be back with Kurt Eichenwald. Stick around.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And then I'll be picking up your calls too, so stick around. This book in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is All Politics is Local, Why Progressives Must Fight for the States by Megan Winter. And this is from the introduction. On February 20, 2018, 6 days after 17 people were shot and killed at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, Representative Keon McGee, a Democrat from Miami, stood on the floor of the Florida House of Representatives. Looking on from the gallery above were Parkland students who had traveled over 400 miles by bus to Tallahassee with the hope of persuading their state lawmakers to pass gun reforms in Florida. McGee asked the Assembly to vote on a bill that would have banned assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. Representative Carlos Guillermo Smith of Orlando, where a gunman had killed 49 and wounded another 53 people in the Pulse nightclub in 2016, had sponsored the bill, whose chances would expire unless the House bent its usual protocol and acted right at that moment. The shooting at Parkland demands extraordinary action, McGee told the Assembly. He was trying a technical procedural maneuver one that might have worked in an alternate reality without partisan politics. But everyone who understood what it meant that Republicans held a supermajority in the Florida Assembly knew what would come next. Richard Corcoran, the Republican Speaker of the House, interrupted McGee. A few minutes later, the House voted on a party lines, 71-36, not to consider the assault weapons ban. In the gallery, students began to cry. On Twitter, student leader Emma Gonzalez wrote, "The anger that I feel right now is indescribable." Something unusual was happening. With their eloquence, temerity, and rage, the Parkland students had seized national attention. Major news networks and papers dispatched reporters to cover their calls for change. That week in February, even before knowing that hundreds of thousands of students nationwide would soon walk out of their schools and through the streets, the American public paid attention to what was happening in Tallahassee, Florida. And yet, from another advantage, the scene in the Florida Capitol that day was not at all unusual. In state houses, it is not uncommon to watch someone sit before a panel of elected officials, hold up a placard of a dead child killed by opioids or lack of insurance or a gun, and plead for the passage of a bill that will inevitably not move out of committee because it does not fit within the political calculus of the Assembly's leadership. In those hearing rooms, ordinary people often share in breathtaking impotence. 3 weeks before the Parkland students arrived in Tallahassee, for example, the Florida Senate Judiciary Committee discussed the Rule of Law Adherence Act, which would have required all local government officials, explicitly including employees of the state university system, to turn over information about immigrants to federal immigration officials. The bill was similar to those shopped around the country by the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, an organization that since the 1970s has written experimental conservative state legislation. ALEC's corporate members included GEO Group, the largest provider of detention services for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and a major donor to Florida Republicans in Donald Trump's presidential campaign. In 2016, the federal government decided to stop contracting with private prisons because the Department of Justice investigation had found they were unsafe. But after Trump's inauguration in early 2017, GEO Group received $774 million worth of contracts to run federal prisons. On January 30th, 2018, the day that the Florida immigration bill was considered in Tallahassee, so many people showed up that the hearing room reached capacity. Muslim students and Latino farm workers and their teenage children who had traveled hours to testify against the bill were not allowed into the packed room. Expressionless, they watched the proceedings on a television mounted in a hallway as Florida Senator Aaron Bean stood at the podium and said that his bill means criminals will be kept off the streets. The bill did not advance in what counts as a victory, in part because in 2011, immigrant rights groups staged weeks-long protests in Tallahassee to oppose a bill modeled after Arizona's 2010 law that allowed police officers to ask for immigration papers if they suspected someone was undocumented. The Florida legislature didn't pass a new aggressive anti-immigration law until 2019, when it gave the state the power to sue local law enforcement that refused to detain people according to orders from federal immigration officials. The next day, January 31st, Floridians concerned about sea level rise arrived in Tallahassee by the busload to ask their legislators to pass a raft of proactive climate change bills. Many were college students or recent graduates who had grown up along the coast and understood that the window of opportunity for stalling climate change was rapidly closing. During their lifetimes, they told me, their hometowns would be radically altered, if not sunken. By the end of the legislative session that March, none of the bills they wanted were passed, even though just 10 years ago it was all but mandatory for both Democrats and Republicans in Florida to at least make overtures about the need for proactive environmental laws. Similar scenes play out in hearing rooms across the country, usually unrecognized by the American public. Beneath the tumult of the Trump presidency, state lawmakers have largely kept their course. As ALEC's own website explained in 2017, quote, state legislatures around the country have made significant progress passing bills on issues such as immigration, policing, and health care, even as Republicans in Congress and President Trump have struggled to make similar progress at the federal level, end of quote. After decades of state-based campaigns coordinated by Libertarian and Republican operatives and disinvestment in the states, right-wing politicians have swept control of state houses. All politics is local. Eichenwald is in the studio with us, the best-selling author, senior reporter, writer at Newsweek, contributing editor of Vanity Fair, previously senior writer at the New York Times for 2 decades, where he was a 2-time finalist for Pulitzer Prize. His latest book is A Mind Unraveled, a memoir. Kurt Eichenwald with a K, K-U-R-T, Eichenwald.com is his website. You could tweet him at Kurt Eichenwald. Kurt, welcome.
Great to
see you again. It's been a while since you've been on the show. You put together this amazing Twitter stream about what the deal is with Hunter Biden and Joe Biden. And it's a complete reframe that I think nobody gets. And, you know, I mean, up until I read your Twitter feed, I was just running on the assumption, which is basically kind of the Democratic Party position by and large, that, you know, Hunter Biden is like Billy Carter. You know, that, you know, or Rodham,
he'll have his own beer.
Yeah, or
soon.
Hugh Rodham, you know, Hillary Clinton's brother. That, you know, he's just, you know, the black sheep of the family kind of thing. But you've got a different story here that I find absolutely fascinating. Tell me about this.
Well, the primary thing here is the essence of the quote unquote scandal is the departure of the prosecutor general of the Ukraine, Viktor Shokin. And one of the things, you know, they make it out to be this ridiculous conspiracy theory that Joe Biden said in December of 2015, you know, if you don't get rid of this guy who is blocking the attempts to solve corruption in Ukraine, if you don't get rid of this guy, we are not going to guarantee your loans for $1 billion. And then what happens promptly is absolutely nothing. And it is not until months later when the economics minister of Ukraine resigns, saying Shokin is corrupt.
Shokin, the prosecutor.
Yeah. And then that is followed by the International Monetary Fund saying we are going to withhold $48 billion unless, that we have committed to you unless something is done about this corrupt guy. Then his deputy resigns saying he is corrupt, and it's the next day. You know, this all takes place in a week. It's the next day that he resigns.
So none of this had to do with Joe Biden. This
nothing.
Was the IMF and
nothing. I mean, you had the IMF, you had the European Union, you had Western investors, you did have the United States, you had the IMF. All of them going, this man is blocking all of the attempts to solve the corruption problem. He's blocking the formation of the group that is supposed to be focused on Ukrainian corruption. All of this is being stopped by this one man, and you've got to get him out of the way, because one of the things was that all of the money that was being pledged by all of these different groups was based on Ukraine pulling itself out of intense corruption that has been undermining the government, and that in the end was going to make them more susceptible to infiltration by the Russians. And so everybody wanted to give them money as sort of a counterbalance to Russia. And when they saw that Viktor Shokin was making it stop, they all pulled their money back and saying, you're not fighting corruption because of this guy.
So Trump is running an ad right now, the Trump re-election campaign. They just did a $10 million media buy. And they're running an ad where they've got Biden saying, you know, I told him if he didn't get rid of that prosecutor, I'd pull the $1 billion. And son of a gun, a little stronger word, but, you know, son of a gun, they fired him.
And that is a complete falsehood.
Right. So number one, yeah. So
he didn't help himself.
So Biden was claiming credit for something that he didn't do. Number one. Number two, though, the allegation being made in the Trump ad is that Biden was doing this because Shokin, this prosecutor who was fired, was investigating Biden's son and Biden's son's company.
Totally false.
So tell me about that.
Biden was brought on to a company. Suddenly, the name drops out of my head. An oil and gas company in Ukraine that was founded by a gentleman who was
Burisma.
Yes. That's the name of the company. And that was founded by a man who formerly was in the government. He was being investigated for taking bribes, money laundering, and tax evasion from what he did in 2012.
This is before Hunter Biden.
This is before Hunter Biden. And the investigation, the British got involved in that investigation because some of his money went there. And the entity that he was alleged to have utilized was an investment fund that had as one of its investments Burisma. And so ultimately what you're talking about is this quote-unquote Hunter Biden scandal is actually an investigation of a guy who was a government official for his actions as a government official who had a fund, and he is accused of having used that fund to launder money out of the United States. Notice Burisma isn't in it at all. And the idea that the directors, let's talk about the directors who joined with Hunter Biden. It includes...
Now, hang on just a second. Just to boil this down into simple English, the company itself was corrupt. Mm-hmm. The new government came in, and when the prosecutor left, basically the government said, we're going to clean all this stuff up, including this company.
Well, no, that was already happening.
Okay, so...
it wasn't a company. It was this guy.
Okay,
here's the way to think of it. It's very simple. It is as if... Bill Gates was under criminal investigation for for money laundering and tax fraud from a time when he served in the government. Let's pretend that. And so what they are claiming is that a member of the board of Microsoft is under criminal investigation because Bill Gates is under criminal investigation for what he did when he was a government official. It has no connection.
Right. So the company was trying to clean up itself and its image, and so they invited some squeaky clean guys onto their board.
Yeah.
And so again, one of those guys was Hunter Biden, the son of the vice president. Who were the other people?
The former president of Poland, and
who was not a corrupt guy.
No. And the former head of the counterterrorism center at the CIA under George W. Bush.
Is that Black, was his name?
It was Cofer Black. And so, you had these... Now, why Hunter Biden? The idea is, Hunter Biden is this nobody. No, in fact, Hunter Biden was their lawyer. Hunter Biden was part of a very prominent law firm, David Boies' law firm, called Boies Schiller. And Boies Schiller...
It's a D.C.-based law firm.
D.C.-based law firm, very big, very prominent. And Hunter Biden was assigned to represent Burisma. And part of the element that Boies Schiller had as them being... their representative is they had to have a role in helping to clean up, helping to observe, and so Hunter Biden was put on the board. So you look at this, it's all standard bit. Now, do I think Hunter Biden should have been on that board? Probably not. But, ultimately...
Because of the optics, not
because of the optics.
Yeah.
Because of the optics. And, it's not a surprise when you think about it. These are all events from, the distant past. And everybody knew that these events had taken place. And suddenly, Joe Biden is leading the polls, and shock, it's a scandal. It's one of the ridiculous things. And as soon as somebody else is leading in the polls, there'll be some new scandal.
They're working. They've got the Bernie scandals, right? Oh, my God, he honeymooned in Russia or something like that. And now they're digging up the ones on Elizabeth Warren. I guarantee you.
Yeah, and what's wrong with that? I don't care about opposition research paid for by the campaign. What is terrible about this and is new about this over the last 8 years is that the GOP is using government for opposition research. You know, it is, I mean, if you go back, Benghazi, what was the scandal there? They never said. They just said Benghazi.
Well, I think the scandal was actually that the State Department had come to Congress and said, we need money to harden some of our facilities, including the CIA station, or the State Department station, but the CIA was using it, at Benghazi. And the Republican-controlled Congress said, no, we won't give you the additional money. That happened three or 4 years before Benghazi. That was the real scandal.
But you look at it and it's like there was a terrorist attack on a State Department facility. Guess what? That happens. You know, that happens a lot.
It happened like 5 or 6 times during the Bush administration.
Yeah.
During George W. Bush.
And so, you know, people want to say, when you say, what's the scandal? Their response is, people died. I was like, yes. What's the scandal? People die in the Middle East in war-torn countries.
Well, the allegation that they made was that Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State, had somehow directed the somebody to stand down and not rescue these guys.
Yeah.
I mean, this is just whole cloth.
It's just made up. I mean, if you go back and look at it, the scandal, you know, this happened on September 11th of 2012. And the scandal, quote unquote, was the scandal was the Obama scandal up until he won re-election. And as soon as he won re-election, it became the Hillary scandal because now she was the next.
I had forgotten that.
Yeah,
I had completely forgotten.
Yeah, and if Hillary had moved aside, they would have totally blocked. They would have dropped Benghazi, and they would have started running hearings on whoever was leading in the polls at that point. I mean, this is one of the problems, and this is how they got themselves where they are. One of the problems with the GOP is that they cannot anymore run on ideas. You know, what are their ideas? Tax cuts, we hate homosexuals, but no, we really don't, but we'll say we do until we're, away from people who hate homosexuals. And what else? Deregulation. Okay, how many times can you say this?
Muslims.
Yeah, Muslims. So it's
black people, Hispanics.
Yeah. So it's hate and let's make the rich richer. Those are not ideas. So what do they have left? They have let's make the Democrats out to be
as corrupt as we are.
As corrupt as we are. And let's just make stuff up. And and this is what's wrong for someone like me, is that I dig into the facts. I dig into what are the regulations surrounding the use of private email servers in the State Department pre-2013. And one of the things people don't know, when the New York Times started getting challenged on that, they cited something in the Federal Register, but apparently they didn't read it. Because I went and looked at it and wrote an article saying it says the opposite of what they claim. It says, if you're using a private server, here's what you need to do. It's like, well, this obviously allows it.
So Hillary Clinton
didn't do anything wrong.
Does that mean that apparently Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump are using a private server?
Yeah, and so did
Is that
Cohn.
okay?
Well, no, the rules changed in 2013. But if you want to go back,
are breaking the law.
If you want to go back in time, yes, Hillary had a private server. You know what Colin Powell used for his private emails within the State Department?
It was AOL.
It was AOL.
Yeah.
It was an AOL plugged into the wall of his office on a laptop. You had Condoleezza Rice.
But that was the Bush administration.
That was the Bush, so it's okay.
Right,
yeah.
in Republican world. Okay, we got to take a break here. We're talking with Kurt Eichenwald, just fabulous, best-selling author and senior writer at Newsweek, contributing editor of Vanity Fair, et cetera, former senior writer at the New York Times. And we'll be back with more of Kurt. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
It's 48 minutes past the hour. We'll be right back with more Kurt Eichenwald. So you were, Kurt Eichenwald, you were about to say what really upsets you about all this.
what happens is that the Republicans go off and they start making an argument, and they feed it through Fox News, and they feed it through the bubble, and eventually what happens is that the political reporters pick it up. And, when you stand back, when someone like me comes along and says, no, let's talk about it, it takes a lot of information to say this is nonsense. And but a lot of the reporters are just doing the, Congressman X says Y, and the response is this. And it's like, why don't you look into what Y is? Why don't you check the regulation? Why don't you find out the history of Ukraine? Why don't you find out who this prosecutor was and what does anyone really believe that Joe Biden walked in and said, we're going to withhold $1 billion loan guarantee when Ukraine was getting $48 billion from the IMF, and they say, oh, we're going to start firing people. And, they don't know that his deputy resigned. They don't know that the IMF was even giving any money. They don't know about the EU giving any money. They don't know the basics of any of these scandals. And they keep perpetuating them. And, the end point is any time someone says this, some Republican says this, there needs to be the response. There needs to be the question of, so you don't think that the resignation of his deputy the day before he resigned, where he accused him on national television of corruption, do you think that had nothing to do with it? Do you think that the IMF, the IMF threatened to withhold $48 billion for the same reason?
Isn't the bigger lesson here that every time the Republican Party or individual Republicans get away with these lies, and we've seen this, by the way, we also see this in social issues. You see this, going back to Reagan's stuff around AIDS. You see this around some of the abortion debates. You see this around some of the birth control debate. They just literally make stuff up. Mm-hmm. And, killing babies after they're born, infanticide. They're now passing laws against infanticide. Nobody's practicing infanticide. And the more they get away with it, the more they do it. And it's this both sidesism in the media.
And what it is the corruption of America by Fox News. Republicans know they can literally say anything.
Did you see Kevin Rudd's piece in the Sydney Morning Herald?
No.
This is maybe 8-10 months ago, maybe a year ago. He wrote Kevin Rudd is the former Prime Minister of Australia, the last relatively progressive Prime Minister of Australia, as far as I know. And he wrote an op-ed titled, "Rupert Murdoch is the cancer at the heart of Australian democracy."
Yeah.
And he documents this in this op-ed. It's maybe 2,000 words. And he goes into how Murdoch took over the media in Australia, how Murdoch now owns more than 50% of all the media in Australia, or the print media. Then he went to the UK and he took over and he corrupted the government in Australia. Then he went to the UK and corrupted the government there. And then he came to the US and corrupted the government here. And it's a mind-boggling, via Fox News, it's a mind-boggling piece. I strongly recommend it to you. We'll be back with Kurt Eichenwald in just a moment. Stick around.
Oh, wait. Am I...
Kurt Eichenwald is with us, one of our favorite reporters. In fact, this retweet from to your favorite reporter. It's Kurt. We've been talking about just a moment ago. We were talking about how Fox News seems to be at the core of so much of this stuff. It's the place where the poison begins. There was an interesting op-ed a couple of days ago. I'm trying to remember who wrote it, suggesting that really the Murdoch family holds the fate and future of the United States in their hands. Rupert has turned over to his son Lachlan apparently most of the control of Fox News, and nobody quite knows which direction he's going to go. Lachlan's brother is fairly progressive, or at least his wife is outspokenly progressive. Lachlan himself appears to be more of kind of an old school conservative, but not a crazed reactionary like his father, Rupert. Any sense of where this is all going? We're seeing Fox News right now break into open conflict on the air, between the reporters like Shep Smith and Chris Wallace and the primetime talent like Sean Hannity.
I don't think anything's going to change. And one of the reasons is that literally they have crazy people in their primetime episodes.
Are they crazy people, or are they people who have figured out that with this story we can grab viewers and make a hell of a lot of money?
No, I've debated this in my head for a long time. Take Sean Hannity. Is he crazy or does he believe it? And if you go back and you look, there was that filing.
Or is he just a cynical,
No, he's crazy. When you go back and you look at his text messages with Paul Manafort, and those were filed in court, he is sitting there talking about the deep state, which is something they made up when Trump became president. And he literally believes that there is some vast conspiracy. I mean, there's no difference between what he believes and what Joe McCarthy was pushing. I have in my hand the names of 57 communists in the State Department.
And it turned out it was a piece of paper that had no such list.
Yeah, and ultimately what Sean Hannity had done is that he believes his own garbage. And when you have that kind of person pushing stuff out, the Republican Party, knowing they can say anything, and it will get pushed out. And then they had the big mistake, the big problem is that they elected someone who was too dumb to know that it was all a scam. And so he set off, other governments and his own people to go chase down the conspiracy theories, which is it is the ultimate endpoint here.
Right. You're supposed to promote the conspiracy theories, bring in the rubes, bring in the money, but you don't actually dig deep into them, because once you do, they're going to fall apart. But that's what Bill Barr is doing right now. And, in my new book, I've got on page 118, I think it starts, 4 pages about how Bill Barr shut down the Iran-Contra investigation. The same way, by pardoning Ollie North and Elliot Abrams and 5 other people, Casper Weinberger. Lawrence Walsh went nuts, screaming headline in the New York Times and Christmas Eve 1992. Attorney General Bill Barr covers up. Lawrence Walsh was crazed by this. So you've got all this stuff going on, and now you've got Barr now trying to discredit not just the current scandal that has to do with Ukraine. You've got him trying to discredit the Mueller investigation.
Which I don't understand why people aren't going more nuts about that. Mueller indicted or got guilty pleas from 37 people and organizations.
Right.
That's a waste of time. And in terms of them saying, it wasn't Russia, it was Ukraine, you have Sweden saying it was Russia, you have Britain saying it was Russia.
Israel saying, everybody.
Everybody.
Yeah. Kurt Eichenwald. Kurt, thanks so much for dropping by. Great having you in the studio. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
Our selection today for the Thom Hartmann Book Club is This Land, How Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption Are Ruining the American West by Christopher Ketchum. This is from chapter 1. It's about halfway through the chapter. He's talking about Bernard DeVoto. DeVoto was the first major historian of the West who was also an environmentalist and an activist, the first chronicler of what Wallace Stenger called the West's curious desire to rape itself. DeVoto was a Westerner raised in Utah. He suffered in the provincialism and intolerance of Mormon country, went east to study, and then teach at Harvard, settled in Cambridge, but never forgot the beauty of his native ground. Loving the land and history, said a magazine profile, but loathing the society. His histories, novels, criticism, his essays in Harper's Magazine were for 20 years, where for 20 years he wrote the oldest column in American journalism, Easy Chair, pointed always west. His trilogy, published in the 1940s, The Year of Decision, Across the Wide Missouri, and The Course of Empire, garnered the Pulitzer, the Bancroft, and the National Book Award. Widely celebrated, DeVoto used his position to become his generation's most outspoken defender of the public lands. He called the West a plundered province, a resource colony for corporations and absentee landlords who practiced, quote, an economy of liquidation. He was broad in his assault on the liquidators. He went after the timbermen, the mining companies, the stockmen, the cattle barons, the oilmen and gasmen, the overgrazers, the deforesters, the denuders, the profiteers of gold rushes and grass rushes. He named the bankers and congressmen who abetted the plundering, the Western hogs, he called them. They've been busy for a century laying waste to the West. Long before the public domain was vested with any permanence legally in the hands of the American people, before there was a consideration of the land itself or any environmental ethic, the West had been torn up, beaten down, subjected to the greed and profligacy of the commodity users. Ironically, the users, in their race to liquidate, helped drive the creation of the public land system we know today, as they proved the need for federal stewardship to stop their abuses. Massive timber frauds in the 19th century, the largest land frauds seen in the West, led directly to the establishment of the Forest Service in the 20th century, its purpose to stop deforestation. Out-of-control cattle numbers in the steppe, overgrazing that turned the fragile soil to dust, led directly to the federal grazing regulatory system that eventually became the BLM. When in 1946 the commodity users conspired to destroy the public land system, the system in which DeVoto saw the only hope for Western conservation and preservation, he stood to oppose them. Quote, he was the first conservationist in nearly half a century, except for Franklin D. Roosevelt, to command a national audience, said Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a student of his at Harvard. No one did more in the post-war years to rouse public opinion against the spoilers than DeVoto. DeVoto and Schlesinger had seen firsthand what unregulated industry could wreak in the arid lands when they drove cross-country together in the spring of 1940 and entered western Kansas past the 100th meridian. These were the last years of the Dust Bowl before FDR's soil conservation programs and the return rains of the 40s could heal the land. Wrote DeVoto, a cemetery was 10 inches deep in sand. Half the headstones had toppled into it and been partly covered. Sagging shacks that had been farmhouses had their windows blown out, and dust was 2 or 4 or 6 feet deep against their western walls and a foot deep against the far wall. A repulsive dust as fine as sifted flour. Now, 6 years after that trip with Schlesinger, DeVoto was confronted with the West's cattle barons, the liquidators of the grass, who were hell-bent on reducing the region to the same mess of dust. In 1946, the Joint Committee on Public Lands of the American National Livestock Association met in Salt Lake City to discuss the goal of undermining what few regulations had been placed on livestock operators under the newly formed Bureau of Land Management. The stock growers' ambition went further than mere deregulation. They hatched a plan with the help of friends in Congress to begin moving all federal land, the BLM and Forest Service domain, as well as the national parks, into the control of the states. The plan evolved through 1946, 47, 48, with legislation making its way on Capitol Hill. DeVoto covered the story for Harper's. He cautioned that the stock growers were attempting, quote, one of the biggest land grabs in American history. The public lands are first to be transferred to the states on the wholly justified assumption that there should be a state government not wholly compliant to the desires of stock growers. It could be pressured into compliance, he wrote in Harper's. Nothing in history suggests the states are adequate to protect their own resources or even want to, or suggest that cattlemen and sheepmen are capable of regulating themselves even for their own benefit, still less the public's, end quote. The long-term plan, he said, was to get rid of the public lands altogether, to place the common possession of the American people into private hands. The livestock industry went on the attack, mounted a PR campaign to discredit Devoto, and pressured Harper's to cease its support. Unmoved, the magazine continued for 3 years to publish his relentless exposés of the intrigues in the state houses and in the Western Caucasus. Devoto had convinced the editors, when no other publication that mattered in the East cared, that the threat of such land transfer was an existential one. This Land by Christopher. So every 5 years, the U.S. Department of Agriculture comes out with new guidelines, and we just put up a video over at ThomHartmann.com for supporters of our program that talks about how the Trump administration, in this insanely corrupt deal with the $100 billion industry of ultra-processed, high-sugar, high-salt, high-fat foods that is literally killing 700,000 Americans a year, has said, oh, we're going to change the guidelines so that these fast food, high-processed food companies can shovel their stuff into our school lunch programs, into our kids. We're going to change the guidelines so people aren't informed about the importance of, dialing back somewhat on meat and on salt and sugar and all these other things. It's nuts. You can check the whole thing out over at ThomHartmann.com. Look for the video for our, the supporters of our program at ThomHartmann.com.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Well, that was pretty amazing. We spent about a half hour with a guy I think is one of the best reporters in America, Kurt Eichenwald, New York Times, Newsweek, New York Times bestseller, et cetera. And the thing about Hunter Biden, as I mentioned, if you're just tuning in, I'll just recap very, very quickly. I had been assuming, and I think probably this is the main narrative among Democrats, is that Joe Biden's son Hunter was basically, he took this gig basically as a way of capitalizing on his dad's being vice president and to make a few bucks. Sort of like Billy Bush capitalizing on, Billy Carter capitalizing on Jimmy Carter's being president, or Hugh Rodham capitalizing on Hillary Clinton being Secretary of State or a senator or a presidential candidate. We've all seen kind of what are referred to as the black sheep of the family kind of thing. And, that was my operating assumption, was that, Hunter Biden, hey, yeah, sure, I'll take the money. It turns out, as Kurt Eichenwald laid out, and as his reporting, makes very, very clear, the prosecutor who got fired because he was so corrupt he wouldn't investigate anything did not and never was investigating Hunter Biden or Burisma or the company. So A, that claim is a complete lie. B, that this gas company, Burisma, was trying to clean up their act because one of the guys on their board of directors was corrupt and was under indictment. And they were they jettisoned him, and they tried to bring onto their board of directors some squeaky clean people who would give them a good reputation. And so they brought on the former president of Poland, who was a reformer and viewed all across Europe as a good government guy. They brought him on their board. They brought Cofer Black on their board of directors, former head of counterterrorism for the CIA under George W. Bush. They put him on their board. And they brought on Hunter Biden, who was a big shot lawyer with one of the biggest law firms in Washington, D.C., a law firm that charges $1,000 an hour for their time. And they put him on the board. And it was all their way of saying, we're cleaning things up. And in fact, that's what they were doing. So Hunter Biden not only was not there to trade on his dad's name, or you could argue that the company was trading on his dad's name in as much as they were saying, this is part of our effort to clean up our act. And in fact, they did clean up their act as much as a fossil fuel company can, according to Kurt Eichenwald's reporting. which means that, this Trump ad about how, in fact, also Eichenwald pointed out that in the Trump ad and in the Trump narrative, which is, bouncing around the right-wing ecosphere, Joe Biden is claiming, and Joe Biden did claim this, that we threatened to withhold $1 billion worth of loan guarantees to Ukraine if they didn't fire this corrupt prosecutor who was refusing to basically prosecute the corrupt oligarchs in Ukraine, in whose pay he probably was. Yeah, Joe Biden claimed that. He says, we withheld $1 billion and suddenly they fired him. But before he was fired, the IMF withheld $48 billion. And then the day before he resigned, he wasn't actually fired, he resigned. The day before he resigned, his assistant resigned on national television saying, I can't be the assistant to this prosecutor anymore because he's so corrupt he won't prosecute. So the guy had overwhelming pressure, had nothing. Actually, Joe Biden was claiming credit for something that he didn't deserve credit for. But it sure is being used against him right now. Independent of Democratic politics, whether you like Joe Biden or not as the Democratic candidate, and I'm inclined to, I'm not the biggest fan in the world of Joe Biden. Like I said, if he's the nominee of our party, I'll do everything I can to get him elected, blue no matter who. But, I'd like somebody a little more progressive. But still, this has nothing to do with that, right? And I think the main point that Kurt made, and I want to echo this, is that the Republican Party has nothing to offer. They haven't had anything to offer since 1980. In 1980, the Republican Party was taken over by what we would refer to today as the billionaires and the giant monopolies, the big corporations. This was made possible by two Supreme Court decisions in 1976 and 1978, Buckley and First National Bank, in which the Supreme Court, for the first time in the history of America, something the Congress never said. In fact, Congress had just said the opposite just 2 years earlier. Congress said, after the Nixon bribery scandals, enough. Big money cannot play that big a role in politics. We're going to limit campaign contributions to a couple $1,000, and billionaires can no longer own politicians. No more bribing public officials. And the Supreme Court came along and knocked those laws down with this Buckley decision and said, in 76, it's fine for billionaires to own politicians. And then in 78, they said, in the First National Bank decisions, they said, and by the way, corporations can own politicians too. And so in 79, this avalanche of corporate money and billionaire money was poured into the Republican Party and put Ronald Reagan in the White House. And that was the end of the conservative movement. That was the end of my dad's Republican Party. And ever since 1981, the Republican Party has nothing to sell the American people. They have been dancing to the tune of very rich people and big corporations. Period, full stop. And, as Kurt Eichenwald was pointing out in the last hour, the big mistake that they made was hiring a guy, Donald Trump, who actually believed the lies that they pump out to keep the rubes in line. I mean, they promote these ideas to get, the poor people who watch Fox News and listen to right-wing hate radio to think that there's this elaborate conspiracy and there's this deep state and there's this, and quack, 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 all these weird, and they're trying to kill babies after they're born and, all these weird conspiracy theories that the Republican Party promotes. They're just there to keep the rubes in line. Just there to keep the suckers contributing. Hey, just keep sending the money. I mean, I literally every day now, well, maybe 4 or 5 times a week anyway, I'm getting an email begging for money from the Trump campaign. Fred, they're coming after us. Fred, they want to shut you up. The emails say. In fact, I'm guessing that if they were to look, if the Federal Election Commission, which is paralyzed now, Federal Election Commission cannot look into this because Donald Trump will not appoint any more members to it's not called the board of directors, but whatever, the commissioners. They have to have a certain number of commissioners in order to have a quorum, and they're one below that right now. So they literally can't even meet and decide anything. Ellen Weintraub, who is the chair of the Federal Election Commission, tried to publish some information, and the FTC wouldn't publish it. The Trump administration wouldn't allow it to be published. So she published it on Twitter, for goodness sake. But if the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, was to look into people who are donating to the Trump campaign right now, and this is pure speculation on my part based on the emails I've been getting. Keep in mind, the average age of a Fox News viewer is 70, which means they've got a lot of people who are in their 80s and maybe some in their 90s. And I'm guessing that a lot of those people are just literally having their savings evaporate because they keep contributing to the Trump campaign because they keep getting these hysterical emails. If you have a parent or a grandparent who watches Fox News, you might want to check their bank account or their credit cards. Now, you're only supposed to be able to contribute, I think it's $2,400 or $2,700, whatever it is less than $3,000. That's the most you're supposed to be able to contribute to a candidate. But we know now that in the 2016 election, the Trump campaign broke all kinds of campaign finance laws, including taking too much money from a bunch of people. I'm guessing that right now it's hundreds of thousands of people who've contributed way beyond the limit. And you might have, senior citizens who are responding to every other Trump email by sending another $50. And they might have sent, by this point now, 3 years into this, they might have sent $50,000, $100,000. They might have sent their entire life savings to Donald Trump. But nobody is overseeing this. Nobody is looking at it because Trump has shut down the Federal Election Commission. The cops are not on the beat. But I'm telling you, if Grandpa is doing this, if Grandpa is watching Fox News, check Grandpa's credit card and bank statements and do it quick. Because I think that Donald Trump and this scam, which is the Republican Party, are probably draining the retirement savings of a lot of senior citizens in America. And the Murdoch family's up to their eyeballs in this. And let's hope that Lachlan Murdoch wakes up and sees what's going on the network that he's now in charge of. Because this is not good for America. It's not good for the future of the world either. And now we've got, not only do we have, Trump and his buddies saying, there's nothing to investigate with regard to trying to blackmail essentially the president of Ukraine, or bribe him. This bribery is one of the things you can be impeached for. This was a naked attempt at bribery. But now you've got them saying, oh, and by the way, the Russians didn't interfere in the election, and we're going to get the Australian Prime Minister to prove it.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And they went to Boris Johnson, too, and said, hey, you got to help us out. What? And welcome back. Wow. I mean, this is just, the whole thing is just absolutely mind-boggling. And so anyhow, let's get into this. Gail in Antelope, California, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Gail, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you fine. Wasn't that thing with Kurt amazing?
Okay, good. Sorry. Okay. Just a couple of things I want to run by you. I liked the interview with Kurt. That was really good. But, I think I have heard the word unprecedented probably 5,000 times since all of this has gone on.
Right.
And every time they do something new, everybody is like, oh, we're shocked. How could this be happening? This is crazy. This is bonkers. This is unprecedented. Actually, it really makes a lot of sense if you think about it in this term. We've had cuckoo berries come before our country, with McCarthy and all those other lunatics. But they really had the backing of a foreign entity before.
Right.
If anybody thinks that Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, and Bill Barr are like doing this on their own, they're not. If you consider that if you took a picture and you flashed it across the TV screen of Vladimir Putin sitting in the Oval Office in the White House with a phone in one hand and a pen in the other, then none of this would be unprecedented. None of it would be shocking. It would make perfect sense. And I think people really have not grasped a hold of the idea in general that really Vladimir Putin is practically running this country and dictating foreign policy. This is all being done for his benefit.
That was essentially the point that Yeah, hang on just a second, Gail. That was essentially the point that Rachel Maddow made on her TV show last night. And at least, but let me finish with regard to Donald Trump. And I get it, where Trump may be either being blackmailed by President Putin, PP tapes or God only knows what, or he might be being enticed by Putin. Yes, when you get out of the White House, we've got $1 billion project for you in downtown Moscow, the new biggest Trump tower in the world. I get that. What I don't get is why Mike Pompeo and Bill Barr would jump on that particular train. I get where they would be loyal to Trump, where they would say, okay, we want to try and get, the president of Ukraine to say we're wonderful or whatever, but I don't get where those two guys would say, we're going to do things that are in the best interest of Russia and not in the best interest of the United States.
They probably have completely self-centered motives, and we don't really know a lot about their background. I mean, they just kind of popped up. I mean, we never really heard a lot.
Barr was the Attorney General in '92. He was the one who covered up Iran-Contra.
Yeah, and how many people even remember that?
Yeah.
See, people have short-term memories. They do. And as far as the GOP goes, they're nothing but a bunch of political whores. They sold themselves out to money years ago. Yeah. Period.
Well, and that's one possible explanation, is that it's not so much that they're loyal to either Putin or Russia, but they're loyal to money. And, there's probably more billionaires floating around, Russia and the former Soviet states than there are in the United States. I don't know if actually I think we have more billionaires than anybody in the world, but you get my point. I mean, there might be a lot of money being dangled out there for people, for good soldiers like Barr and Pompeo, but to think that these guys would actually, I can see Trump actually working for a foreign power. The rest of them,
because he's stupid.
Well, because he's greedy. But the rest of them,
and he's not very bright.
He's been taking money from Russian oligarchs and Ukrainian oligarchs and every other kind of oligarch, Panamanian oligarchs for decades. I get that, but Pompeo and Barr,
Moscow Mitch sold us out for what?
There you go, $200 million, yeah, for Mitch McConnell. You're right, Gail. Thank you for the call. So every 5 years, the U.S. Department of Agriculture comes out with new guidelines, and we just put up a video over at ThomHartmann.com for supporters of our program that talks about how the Trump administration, in this insanely corrupt deal with the $100 billion industry of ultra-processed, high-sugar, high-salt, high-fat foods that is literally killing 700,000 Americans a year, has said, we're going to change the guidelines so that these fast food, high-processed food companies can shovel their stuff into our school lunch programs, into our kids. We're going to change the guidelines so people aren't informed about the importance of, dialing back somewhat on meat and on salt and sugar and all these other things. It's nuts. You can check the whole thing out over at ThomHartmann.com. Look for the video for our, the supporters of our program at ThomHartmann.com. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Just a heads up, today's October 1st. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, is now available. It's probably, if you pre-ordered a copy from Powell's or Amazon or any of the other great online sources, your copy will probably arrive today. If you have a copy waiting in a bookstore, if you've pre-ordered one, or if you just want to go into a bookstore and get a copy, it's around today. And I'm saying that not so much to pitch the book, although, hey, I love it when people read my books. But more to the point is, if you have a copy or when you get your copy, turn to page 118. From page 118 to page 123, and keep in mind, I wrote this book a year and a half ago. From page 118 to 123, I lay out how back in 1992, Attorney General Bill Barr shut down the Iran-Contra investigation into Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush, using Iran to get Reagan elected in 1980. How he shut that down, and how the special prosecutor Lawrence Walsh went absolutely nuts, and how it's screaming headlines in the New York Times on Christmas Eve, 1992. All of it is right there. In addition to how Nixon stole an election, how Reagan stole an election, how George W. Bush stole an election, and all these big corporations and billionaires who were complicit in this, what they wanted was right-wingers on the Supreme Court. They wanted deregulation. They wanted to be able to put more poison in the air, dump more toxins in our water, more crap in our food supply, all so that they could enhance their profits. And that's what they're getting with Trump. He is the pinnacle of this. And that's what they're getting with Trump, with now they've put Kavanaugh and Gorsuch on the Supreme Court, Trump has. And, these guys are going to be the willing toadies for this guy. So just to bring you up to date, Mike Pompeo has now said that even though Congress, the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has asked 5 members of the State Department to come testify before them, Mike Pompeo is saying, no, ain't going to happen. The Attorney General of the United States, Bill Barr, was in Italy over the weekend, is in Spain right now, and set up a conversation. And apparently this is all the same thing. It's all one piece of fabric. They're trying to tear down the Mueller investigation. Now, Robert Mueller got indictments against some 30-plus individuals, got a whole bunch of guilty pleas for specifically Russia messing in our elections in 2016 in a bunch of different ways. What Barr is apparently trying to do is get foreign leaders, Morrison in Australia, the Prime Minister of Spain, the Prime Minister of Italy, trying to get these foreign leaders to help him dig up proof that Mueller was wrong and that it wasn't Russia who interfered with our election in 2016. It was Hillary Clinton and the Democrats. Honest to God, not making this up. They're trying to find evidence that the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton interfered in the 2016 election and that Russia had nothing to do with it. And I think that this, from Trump's point of view, I don't know if this is because, he's dancing to Putin's tune or if this is because it's like his crowd size on inaugural day. He just can't stand the fact that, a majority of Americans think that he's only in the White House because of the involvement of a foreign government. But, that's pretty much the fact. And now you've got Pompeo running around the world, digging into these wild conspiracy theories that, Mueller's investigation was, a bunch of dirt and that what really happened was Hillary and her emails. And in fact, Pompeo has had the State Department investigators retroactively classify Hillary Clinton emails so that they can go after the people whose emails ended up in her inbox. And as Kurt Eichenwald was pointing out, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, it was okay to have a private server. You just had to jump through some hoops, which she jumped through. It's not okay now, though, when Ivanka does it.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Because the law changed. But back during the Bush administration, Colin Powell was using AOL as Secretary of State. It was okay. It was legal back then. Our book today is Cyber War, How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect a President by Kathleen Hall Jamieson. This is from the introduction. Imagine a strategy memo forecasting cyber attacks by Russian hackers, trolls, and bots designed to roil social discontent and damage the electoral process of a major party U.S. presidential nominee. Or, if she winds up winning, sabotage her ability to govern. Guaranteed payoff, no fingerprints, no keystroke record, no contrails in the cloud. To ensure that Americans would believe that disparaging messages about her were made in the U.S., use Bitcoin to buy space and set up virtual private networks on American servers. Distribute hacked content stolen from the accounts of her staff and associates through an intermediary, WikiLeaks. Use identity theft, stolen social security numbers, and appropriated IDs to circumvent Facebook and PayPal's demand for actual names, birth dates, and addresses. On platforms such as Instagram and Twitter, register under assumed names. Diffuse and amplify your attack and advocacy through posts on Facebook, tweets and retweets on Twitter, videos on YouTube, reporting and commentary on RT, blogging on Tumblr, news sharing on Reddit, and viral memes and jokes on 9gag. Add to the mix a video game called Hiltendo, in which a missile-trading Clinton figure vaporizes classified emails sought by the FBI. Employ online agitators and bots to upvote posts from imposter websites such as blackmattersus.com to the top of such subreddits as r/TheDonald and r/Hillary for Prison. Drive content to trend. To maximize the impact of your handiwork, use data analytics and search engine maximization tools built into social media platforms. To test and fuel doubts about the security of U.S. voter information, hack the electoral systems of the states. And throughout the primary and general elections season, seed the notion that if Hillary Clinton were to win, she would have done so by rigging the election, an outcome that would repay her assaults on the legitimacy of their leader's presidency with doubts about her own. Were she instead to lose, she would no longer be a thistle in the toned torso of the hackers and trolls' boss's likely boss. Every result but one produces a desirable outcome for the Kremlin. Outcome 1, Clinton is off the international stage. Outcome 2, she wins but can't govern effectively. Outcome 3, the former Secretary of State is elected and the country simply moves on, but the sabotage nonetheless has magnified cultural tensions and functions as a pilot from which to birth later success, perhaps when she runs for a second term. The only eventuality that damages the Russian cyber soldiers and their commander-in-chief is the fourth, in which, in real time, the cyber attackers are unmasked by a vigilant intelligence community, condemned by those in both major political parties and around the world, characterized by the media as spies and saboteurs. The Russian message is blocked or labeled as Russian propaganda, and when included in media accounts, the stolen content is relentlessly tied to its Russian origins and sources. None of that, however, happened. Instead, to the surprise of the Russian masterminds, as well as both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, he won the Electoral College, and with it a 4-year claim on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Although countrywide she bested him by almost 2.9 million votes, he unexpectedly captured an Electoral College majority by running the table. By the end of the evening of November 8th, Florida, as well as Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, were in his column. The ways in which Russian hacking and social media messaging altered the content of the electoral dialogue and thus contributed to Donald Trump's victory are the subjects of this book. To begin my exploration, this overview chapter will highlight key findings of the U.S. intelligence community, preview my focus on the hackers and trolls and the synergy between them, justify casting the Russian machinations as acts of cyber war, outline ways in which susceptibilities in our system of government and media structures magnified their effect, and note 5 presuppositions that will shape my analysis of the Russian trolls' work, and one that will guide my study of the effects of the hackers. Forming the backdrop for my inquiry are 3 reports on the Russian intervention in the 2016 presidential election. The October 7, 2016 statement jointly issued by the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence on Election Security. The January 2017 conclusion of the U.S. intelligence agencies, CIA, FBI, NSA, and the February 2018 Robert Mueller indictment of 13 of the Russians allegedly behind the social media intrusions. On a day that will live in campaign lore, as much for what didn't happen as what did, more on that in a moment, the first of the 3 revealed the following. The U.S. intelligence community is confident that the Russian government directed the recent compromises of email from U.S. persons and institutions, including the U.S. political organizations. The recent disclosures of alleged hacked emails on sites like DCLeaks.com and WikiLeaks and by the Guccifer 2.0 online persona are consistent with the methods and motives of Russian-directed efforts. These thefts and disclosures were intended to interfere with the U.S. election process. Such activity is not new to Moscow. The Russians have used similar tactics and techniques across Europe and Eurasia, for example, to affect public opinion there. We believe, based on the scope and sensitivity of these efforts, that only Russia's senior-most officials could have authorized these activities. That's from the report. The next report put a name to one of those senior-most officials and specified an intended beneficiary, Donald Trump. cyber war is the.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Seth Abramson tweeting, yesterday was intense. We saw a super serious ex-law enforcement official tell Anderson Cooper on CNN that a tweet by Trump from the last 48 hours likely qualified as an act of criminal sedition. I don't know that anyone over 40 will ever see times like this again in America. Yeah, I think Seth is right. And if you haven't read his book, Proof of Conspiracy, it's really, really worth the effort. Our conversation with Kirk Eichenwald in the last hour was amazing. What's going on in China, by the way, heads up, there's video now of a Chinese police officer in Hong Kong literally walking up to a teenage kid, putting a gun to his head and assassinating him. Say what, Louise? The kid survived? Oh, well, okay, that was a different one. Then I'm sorry, I have it backwards. But you know, one person has died from live fire in Hong Kong now, or at least the media is reporting that. I'm going to have to get my story straight on that. So I will stop that rant until I get some more details printed out and in my hands. But let's pick up some of your phone calls here. Scott in Oakland, California. Hey, Scott, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. So I wanted to call about, we're still not assigning the proper level of evil to these guys. We're calling this search to track down conspiracy theories. That's not what it is. This is an intimidation campaign against anybody who participated in the intelligence product that became the Mueller report. Okay?
Oh, interesting. So you're saying, because Australia did provide us with intelligence, Israel provided us with intelligence. I mean, there was a number of countries you're suggesting that Spain and Italy, these are the countries Barr is visiting now, were also involved.
Well, they have. You have no idea. We wouldn't have any idea of what intelligence agencies were involved in creating providing the product that Mueller used. But the point is, this is a three-pronged attack here. The reclassification of the State Department emails to Hillary Clinton, even if you were just copied on an email.
Right.
Okay? Second, the bounty on the identity of the whistleblower.
Right, they're offering $50,000. And by the way, if I can interrupt you, Scott, this morning on MSNBC, or maybe it was CNN, Natasha Bertrand, the national security reporter, I believe, for the New York Times, it must have been on MSNBC because she's on there regularly. She came on and she said that the people that her sources are telling her that Donald Trump and the rest of the senior staff in the White House have known for at least 3 weeks who the whistleblower actually is. They've known the identity. And which leads to the question of why is Trump and why are his people offering bounties and who is this guy? We need to find him. I should be able to confront him. Why is Trump tweeting about it? Putting my tinfoil hat on, I would speculate that maybe it's because they want their well-armed minions to find this guy and take care of him.
Oh, and also, it's your idea about how to have a good narrative. Your enemy, your villain has to be as dangerous and powerful as your.
That's right. If you want to be Superman, you have to have a Lex Luthor. Otherwise, it's boring. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I was going to say, Bill Barr. We have to remember history. Bill Barr was involved in covering up the importation of cocaine into the country. That was a big part of Iran-Contra.
You're right.
Was the cocaine importation.
Yeah.
How do we forget these things?
I haven't forgotten them, but you're absolutely right, Scott. And the smuggling of weapons into South America and the holding the hostages in Iran it's amazing. I mean, the level of corruption that this guy has been up to his eyeballs in, for apparently a long, long time. Scott, thank you for the call. You made some great points. Amy in San Diego. Hey, Amy, what's up?
Oh, hi, Tom. I had a little glimmer of hope the other day when they sent out the subpoenas to Pompeo. Mm-hmm. But today, they're not going to cooperate with anything. They're not going to do anything they're supposed to do. I think this is a coup. I think our country's over. I don't think anyone can stop them.
Well, let's have this conversation the day after the election in November of next year. I don't think all is lost, Amy, and I think that the American people are waking up. I really do. I still have a lot of. I'm more than 50% optimistic. I get your pessimism. I share your concern, and I frankly, I've been saying for a long, long time. In fact, I've written 2 books about it. One called Screwed, and the other called Rebooting the American Dream. About how
I read them both.
Yeah, about how the plutocrats basically rose up in the 70s because of these Supreme Court decisions, and then in the 80s took over the White House, and then throughout the era of the 80s and 90s took over Congress, and with the Gingrich Revolution and all that in the mid 90s, and then with George W. Bush turned it into an international effort, brought in all their big cronies, made literally trillions of dollars with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. We say, oh, the war in Iraq cost $1.5 trillion, and the war in Afghanistan has cost us $3 trillion so far. Well, it didn't just cost us. It's not like that money got flushed down the toilet. That money ended up in the hands of defense contractors in the U.S., right?
Absolutely.
And Blackwater and stuff like that. So, we saw the takeover. We saw the enrichment. We've seen this whole process, and now we see the corruption of the U.S. government itself with the placement of an oil lobbyist in charge of the Interior Department, which is now selling public lands off for oil drilling, a coal lobbyist in charge of the EPA, who is now cutting back on air pollution regulations, an FCC, the chair of the FCC, Ajit Pai, former Verizon lawyer. I'm not sure if he was a lobbyist or if he was just a lawyer, but basically Verizon's guy. You've got the head of the Defense Department, a former lawyer for Raytheon. I mean, basically Betsy DeVos in charge of education has spent her life essentially lobbying funding lobbying for private schools and for destroying public education. Every single branch of government has now been corrupted by the Republican Party. And so, it's a coup. But we're not gone yet. And regardless of who the Democrats put up as a candidate, any of them, any of the 11 or 12 who are, even the people you think are marginal right now, the 2% people, any of them would govern better than, frankly, anybody has governed this country, in my opinion, since 1980. Since the Carter presidency. So I am very, very hopeful. Amy, I got to move along, but thank you for the call. I appreciate it. Gary in Baden, Pennsylvania. Hey, Gary, what's up?
Hello, Tom. Thank you once more.
You're welcome.
Thom Hartmann, I'm hopeful also. Are you? You can hear me, right?
Yes, sir. Just fine.
Sorry. I'm sorry. That's great. I'm hopeful too, Tom. Maybe not at your level. The reason I'm not at your level is one reason only. Because of a lot of our fellow Americans, they need to wake up and realize this is an abuse of power, and we have entrenched greed across the spectrum.
Right.
And I'm hopeful they need to step up to the plate. I want to close with Abraham Lincoln, if I may. We need the American people, the ones who put Trump in there, to step up to the plate and get him and his imposters out.
Right. Well, the fact that, for example, in Texas, the Republicans, I think they're up to 6 or 7 now, who are saying, no, I'm not going to run for re-election, because they just some of them, I think, are actually in very safe seats, but they're just like, I just can't do it anymore. We can't participate in this charade anymore. I really think it's come to that, Gary. So what you wanted to close with Lincoln? What was the Lincoln quote?
Abraham Lincoln, yes. Abraham Lincoln said, nearly, and this is apropos, I think, nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power.
Yeah. Amen. And we're seeing that writ large. Gary, brilliant. Thank you so much. Tim in Houston, Texas. Hey, Tim, what's up? Tim? Oh, Tim's been waiting on the line there for a while, so I'm going to put him back on hold, and we can figure out what's going on with him. Robbie in Portland, Oregon. Hey, Robbie, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. I wanted to bring up, first of all, you're defending Tom, or you're defending Joe and Hunter, and you just described, I'm
not defending them. I'm describing reality.
Let me get my point out. All right. Let's describe reality. You just said that there was an ex-CIA official, Hunter Biden, who's a part of, obviously a huge conglomerate of wealth, which is trying to control the fossil fuel industry of another nation. That's called imperialism, Tom. But let me get to my point. A lot of people who think that the Russian election interference is, it's like you're saying Sweden knew about it. Why does anybody who thinks that the Russian election interference was a big deal, why do none of them know about Reality Winner?
Well, Reality Winner is a tragedy and a scandal, frankly. I mean,
but see, my point, Tom, is all of your liberal listeners right now who are like, oh, Russia this, and then that one caller is like, oh, Donald Trump's a moron and he's stupid. Nobody knows about Reality Winner. So this person.
So what would you like to say, Robbie? Here you're on the air. What would you like to say about Reality Winner? Go for it.
Reality Winner was a whistleblower who's been arrested, and what I find kind of sad
and is in prison right now.
How we pick and shoot. Yeah, and under the Obama era Espionage Act, or actually I think it was the Bush at that time, she's now serving the longest time, which actually exposed to the American people that our own government knew not only Russia, but 5 other countries were interfering with the voting machine.
Yes,
why is that not
as we have discussed on this program on numerous occasions.
But it's not the main topic of discussion. We're still trying to go back and forth about whether or not. And here,
okay.
Hang on. Let me bring up the last point.
No,
my last point. Okay, Tom?
You're going to have to do it really quick because we're hitting the break here.
Okay. Hillary Clinton and the DNC did rig the primary election. And you're out here saying
I'm not disagreeing with that. Totally Donna Brazile wrote a whole chapter in her autobiography apologizing for it, specifically to Bernie. I mean, come on, Robbie. Robbie, thank you for the call. We'll be back. It's 45 minutes past the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be right back with more of your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Tamara in Joplin, Missouri. What's up?
Hello, Tom. My question is, what is Sebastian Gorka doing on a plane with Mike Pompeo flying to Italy, Macedonia, and Greece?
Right. I don't know, but Sebastian Gorka used to work in the White House. He was a right-wing troll before that, and now I believe he's an employee of Sinclair Broadcasting, isn't he? Doesn't he do regular commentary on Sinclair that they force their 100 and some odd TV stations around the country, including the one here in Portland, to carry?
Yes, but Gorka couldn't even get a White House security clearance, if you recall. But there's one thing in common between Bill Barr and Mike Pompeo is that Joseph Mifsud is in Italy.
Yeah.
And that they're interviewing and talking to him.
Oh, man.
But what is Gorka doing on a plane when he can't get a security clearance?
That's a damn good question, Tamara. I don't know the answer. And this
I was hoping to ask Eric.
Yeah. You mean Kurt Eichenwald?
I meant Kurt. Yeah.
Okay. It's a very good question. I'm going to have to dig into that. Thanks a lot for the call. Beyond in Carl Junction, Missouri. Hey, Beyond, what's up? You want to follow on to Robbie's criticism that when Kurt Eichenwald said that Hunter Biden was brought on the board to clean it up, that's somehow something we shouldn't talk about it?
No, I don't want to have that contentious an argument about it. He was a little angry, but it is a good point, though, that type of corruption is kind of ignored. It's easy to follow Trump's corruption. It's kind of cartoonish.
Right.
He's like a comic book villain. But that kind of corruption, the connection by name, that school scandal where the celebrities are going to go to jail for getting their kids in school.
Right.
That's on top of all the actual normalized corruption, like Jared Kushner and Donald Trump himself benefited from going to school.
All right.
Like when we talk about Donald Trump, it takes away from all the reasons why Donald Trump is in office in the first place, is because so many people like Robbie are just fed up with the whole thing, and they're not wrong. Do you think that this Hunter Biden character is just completely qualified?
No, I've said this on the air probably 24 times in the last week or so, Beyond, that Hunter Biden should have stayed away from anything that would look like his dad was being corrupt. And I think this looks terrible for Joe Biden, and I think it's going to hurt him terribly, I think it already has hurt him. He's falling in the polls right now. And Elizabeth Warren, who is perceived as pretty squeaky clean, I realize there's, debate and discussion about that. But nonetheless, she's skyrocketing right now as a reason. And I think this has something to do with it.
Well, the way you describe it, I think is part of the problem. It's not just looking like corruption. You're very good, like your Supreme Court book. I will be picking it up.
No, it would be corruption if Joe Biden was making money off this. It is corruption on the part of Hunter Biden if he was trading on his father's name. But he's not a public official.
He's not, but it's all connected. Like, we wouldn't care about Hunter Biden if he wasn't Joe Biden's son, and neither would we.
Yeah, I don't know if you're old enough to remember when Jimmy Carter's brother Billy was out there doing similar stuff, although kind of in a more, what do you want to say, hick way, with Billy Beer and all this kind of stuff. But anyhow, Beyond, thanks a lot for the call. We'll be back. So every 5 years, the U.S. Department of Agriculture comes out with new guidelines, and we just put up a video over at ThomHartmann.com for supporters of our program that talks about how the Trump administration, in this insanely corrupt deal with the $100 billion industry of ultra-processed, high-sugar, high-salt, high-fat foods that is literally killing 700,000 Americans a year, has said, we're going to change the guidelines so that these fast food, high-processed food companies can shovel their stuff into our school lunch programs, into our kids. We're going to change the guidelines so people aren't informed about the importance of, dialing back somewhat on meat and on salt and sugar and all these other things. It's nuts. You can check the whole thing out over at ThomHartmann.com. Look for the video for our, the supporters of our program at ThomHartmann.com.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. We're kind of processing all this stuff that's going on. Brad in, is it Rosemont or Minneapolis? Where are you, Brad?
Rosemont, Minnesota.
Rosemont, Minnesota. Okay, cool. What's up?
Wondering what your thoughts are. Usually children of politicians have been off limits, and Hunter Biden clearly is not off limits. Wondering what your thoughts are on the Democrats going full tilt on the Trump kids.
I think that there should be, every time Hunter Biden is mentioned, somebody should be saying something like, well, Ivanka got a whole bunch of trademarks in China.
Exactly.
And, and her husband, Jared Kushner, got $1 billion loan, basically, that was, from a sovereign wealth fund or a giant fund that was largely funded by Qatar, right after Saudi Arabia had basically blackmailed Qatar by cutting off food and medicine to them until they gave the money to Jared Kushner. The bizarre level of naked corruption, and both Kushner and Ivanka using private servers. And now the law has actually been changed. Back when Hillary was doing it, it was legal. There just were certain regulations you had to comply with, which she did. Now it's explicitly illegal as a result of the Republican freakout. And yet, you've got members of the Trump administration doing this. Yeah, I think there's a whole bunch of it there, and a whole bunch of it really worth talking about. So thank you, Brad, for pointing that out. Paul in Woodinville, Washington. Hey, Paul, what's up?
Tom, I don't know if you have ever had this experience or had a loved one who has, but does this make sense to you? Once a cancer patient, always a cancer patient. In other words, you're always susceptible. And right now, this country is being diagnosed with cancer. Right. I'm talking to people who are saying, "Well, he's got to go. We can't let him get away with this." And the thing is this is not a football game. After a certain period of time, the score is such and such. Even if Trump is impeached and removed from office, we are going to be subject to the propaganda blitz that we are being subject to now.
Right, and the corrupt oligarchy, which was established with these Supreme Court rulings that allow money to basically control politics.
And Donald Trump is going to continue to be part of it. Let me ask you this question. What if Donald Trump, if he's removed from office and he's not tried and put into jail, which he should be, decides to move to Russia? And then we have a past president with what he knows about that office, in a foreign. Is he still entitled to Secret Service protection?
God
and what do we do
God
about
knows.
that? He's going.
I don't think he's going to take that many secrets with him because I think that a lot of stuff has been withheld from him. But beyond that, Paul, I think the larger issue is what if, and the thing that we need to be considering is what if Trump negotiates a deal with the Democrats? I mean, it would basically have to be with the Democrats. If he negotiates a deal that let me keep all my money, no, I don't go to jail. Get Letitia James and the Attorney General of New York State to drop all the charges. In fact, just immunize me not just from federal charges, from the state charges, and my kids, and just let us go back to being real estate grifters, and we'll leave you all alone.
No deal. No deal. No
well, that's
deal.
What I would say. I would say these people need to go to jail. But see, this is what happened with Nixon. Nixon cut that kind of a deal, and then Jerry Ford did the pardon. And yeah, some of Nixon's guys, some of his bad guys went to jail, but nobody in his family, nobody that he really cared about went to jail. And that, in my opinion, set up the corruption of the Reagan administration, and then the failure to prosecute that because Bill Barr shut down the investigation in '92. The failure to investigate Iran-Contra set up the corruption of the George W. Bush administration, and George W. Bush and Dick Cheney getting away with war crimes and torture and various forms of what I would call treason. Then I think paved the way for Donald Trump. So every step has added on the last, and if Trump gets away with this, what's going to be coming after Trump? I think it would be somebody like Mussolini.
But Tom, that deal that he's offering is like a king in exile.
Yes.
You protect my family and my money. We get to go elsewhere, and elsewhere he's going to continue to be a propaganda enemy to this country. That's what I'm
agreeing with
you.
I'm agreeing with you,
Yeah.
and but I'm saying we need to steel ourselves. We need to get ready because whether they can impeach him in the Senate or not is probably going to be the thing that this hangs on. And if enough stuff comes out and enough public opinion turns against Donald Trump, and it seems to be moving in that direction, that 20 Republican senators figure, okay, this guy isn't worth going down in flames over. At that point, Trump is going to try and cut a deal. And we need to be talking to Democratic politicians right now well in advance of that and saying...
Well,
go ahead.
Remember, Tom, you're never cured of cancer. You're only in remission.
Yeah. Yeah. So we're never cured of oligarchy and autocracy. We're only in remission. Well, and this gets back to, the point that I was pounding on this program long before Donald Trump came along, which is that we need to have a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United, which would also overturn Buckley and First National Bank and all these other decisions. And, going all the way back to Santa Clara County. Get money out of politics. Get, no more corporate personhood.
Well, those are the steps we can take. To the hard chemo steps we can take to make sure we stay in remission.
Yeah, that's where you pull the cancer out by its roots. That's
That's
to mix
right.
metaphors terribly, but that's that is where you do it, and therefore, and that's why every day on this program I keep bringing this back to the Supreme Court. And why I wrote this book about the Supreme Court that's now available today. A shameless plug. Paul, thanks a lot for the call. It's good talking to you. We'll be back in just a moment with the third hour of our program. Stick around. We'll continue. Actually, we're going to be talking about Where's My Roy Cohn? This is going to get fascinating. You're going to want to hear this. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
Our book today is Future War, Preparing for the New Global Battlefield by Robert, I believe it's pronounced Latif, L-A-T-I-F-F. This is from the introduction. On a sweltering August day following weeks of heightened tension with Russia over its actions in Ukraine and Syria, and harsh words between the United States and China over actions in the South China Sea, and as workers are preparing to depart the cool of their air-conditioned Manhattan office buildings for the gridlocked highways and subways, several large electric power plants along the East Coast simultaneously experienced dramatic overspeed conditions in their large turbine generators. Plant operators are unable to stop the steam turbines, whose automatic control and data systems have been infected by sophisticated computer malware, and they catastrophically tear themselves apart, cutting power to large segments of the population and industries in the Northeast. Building systems shut down, hospitals switch to emergency generators, trains stop running, traffic lights cease operating, and Wall Street trading comes to a halt. At the same time, 1,100 miles to the south, a massive rocket sits fueled and ready to launch a critical national security satellite when an explosive-laden private aircraft flies at low altitude into the Cape Canaveral launch pad area and, despite repeated warnings, slams into the pressurized fuel tank and solid rocket motors, creating an enormous conflagration. Half a world away, elite commandos equipped with the latest high-technology equipment but unidentifiable as a national army attack U.S. and allied interests near areas of disputed territory. Thus are fired the opening shots of a new war. These hypothetical events represent a radically different style of conflict fought with new tools and against new and unfamiliar enemies. When most people think of war, they imagine soldiers doing battle with other soldiers, employing tanks, artillery, and other recognizable weapons. However, in this century, war has morphed into something we can scarcely recognize, and future conflicts will be qualitatively and quantitatively unlike those of the past. They will be fought using innovative and unusual weapons, many of which, because the technologies have both civilian and military uses, will be available to far more people who are far less skilled in their employment. The so-called democratization of technology has diminished the monopoly of advanced countries on the tools of war. 21st century armed conflicts often have no battlefield in the traditional sense. The concept of opposing armies clashing in deadly struggle but moderated by international conventions of behavior seems a thing of the past. In 1999, Chinese colonels Kuo Liang and Wang Shuangshui predicted that soldiers would increasingly be computer hackers, financiers, drug smugglers, and agents of private corporations rather than members of a military, and that their weapons would include not only airplanes, cannons, poison gas bombs, and biochemical agents, but also computer viruses, net browsers, and financial derivative tools. Their predictions were prescient. Yesterday's wars were, like World War II, about saving civilized nations from maniacal dictators, or like the conflicts in Vietnam and Korea, devoted to a clash of ideologies in the attempt to limit the spread of one hegemon over another. They were big affairs involving large military forces and enormous violence. Today's wars are more about cultural and religious hatreds, using violence as a means to change the hearts and minds of people, among whom the killing occurs with more frequency. Tomorrow's wars will be different still, fought largely for political dominance with stealth and cunning, targeting innocents and institutions, heavily dependent on information superiority, and employing strange new weapons. While we have a highly motivated and well-trained and equipped armed forces that will adapt, we are not prepared as a nation to react well to the inevitably messy and ambiguous situations these new conflicts and weapons will present. We still have no clear idea of what constitutes an act of war in cyberspace now, nor of how we might respond to such an act. It is not enough for the military to be prepared. Neither the public nor its decision makers have yet fully comprehended the significance of the changes in the types of conflict and the tools with which they will be fought. Without question, there will be circumstances when decision makers will find it necessary, or at least think it necessary, to send soldiers into classic boots-on-the-ground combat situations. We will continue to project force with our powerful aircraft, our munitions, and our aircraft carrier strike groups. When war is fought in foreign lands, it could well be against other high-tech armies. However, war will increasingly be more personal and often fought closer to home. It will not lend itself to the traditional massive displays of U.S. firepower. It will affect individuals directly, not as some distant conflict we read about in newspapers or watch in the movies or on the internet. Americans will be targeted on U.S. soil, often, as we have seen in San Bernardino and Orlando, by homegrown terrorists. This form of war will be messy and complex, and it will not lend itself to easy, quick, soundbite solutions. It may not even be clear for a while who perpetrated the violence against us. Was it state-sponsored or a random act of terror? Will we unleash massive destruction on foreign countries in retaliation for attacks by terrorists residing on our own soil? If so, to what end and with what consequences? There are always consequences, whether they be the death or capture of our own troops, unnecessary civilian casualties, or the incitement of more violence. The book Future War by Robert Latif. So every 5 years, the U.S. Department of Agriculture comes out with new guidelines, and we just put up a video over at ThomHartmann.com for supporters of our program that talks about how the Trump administration, in this insanely corrupt deal with the $100 billion industry of ultra-processed, high-sugar, high-salt, high-fat foods that is literally killing 700,000 Americans a year, has said, oh, we're going to change the guidelines so that these fast food, high-processed food companies can shovel their stuff into our school lunch programs, into our kids. We're going to change the guidelines so people aren't informed about the importance of, dialing back somewhat on meat and on salt and sugar and all these other things. It's nuts. You can check the whole thing out over at ThomHartmann.com. Look for the video for our, the supporters of our program at ThomHartmann.com.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. So just to recap, and by the way, Matt Tyrnauer, who is the director of the new movie Where's My Roy Cohn, will be with us at the bottom of the hour. In the previous hour, I mentioned he'd be here right now, but he's running a little bit late. And I've watched this movie, and it's mind-boggling. And it's going to be in theaters near you soon. So anyhow, just to recap what's going on, what we're seeing now are two parallel, outrageous scandals, both of them pursuing crazed right-wing wackadoodle conspiracy theories that have been promoted, from Alex Jones to Fox News, basically, in that spectrum, of the right-wingosphere. And, one of those theories is that Joe Biden and his son somehow were corrupt. Well, not somehow. His son was on the board of this gas company. We had Kurt Eichenwald, the New York Times reporter, Newsweek reporter, here in the studio talking about how, well, actually, that was part of an attempt to clean up the company. They put the former Cofer Black, the former head of counterterrorism for the CIA under George W. Bush, on that board. They put the former president of Poland on that board. It still looks bad, and as I've said, I don't think that Hunter Biden should have said yes. They should have gotten somebody else. But that's what they did. But the idea was we're going to try and clean this thing up. But this is being now. Trump is basically trying to bribe. Yes, we'll give you the missiles. These Javelin missiles that can take out tanks. This is bribery. We will give you these missiles if you will give us dirt on Joe Biden. That quid pro quo was so clear in the transcript of his conversation, even including the parts where there's redactions, where the ellipses are. That part was so clear that basically nobody could dispute it who reads the transcript. And the Constitution specifically says that a president shall be impeached for bribery, treason, or high crimes and misdemeanors. This is bribery. And it's not just bribery domestically, it's international bribery. So, we've got this. Donald Trump and the people around him, and now we know that Mike Pompeo was on that call, so he's in on this bribery scandal, attempting to bribe the president of Ukraine into making up dirt on Joe Biden, number one. And number two, now we've got Bill Barr, the Attorney General, traveling around the world, going to Macedonia and Greece and Italy, I believe Spain, talking to, and last week set up a conversation specifically between Donald Trump and Mr. Morrison, the new Prime Minister of Australia, relatively new. In each case, asking them to basically take back what their various intelligence agencies have said, which is that in 2016 they saw evidence that Russia or Russian actors or Russian oligarchs or people or institutions associated with Russia had somehow worked as hard as they possibly could to get Donald Trump in the White House, which was the narrative that Robert Mueller was investigating. He found over 100 instances of collaboration or attempted collaboration between the Trump campaign and agents of Russia, actors in Russia, people associated with Russia or Russian oligarchs, et cetera, et cetera. They found all this stuff. They're trying to undo that. Now, Rachel Maddow is arguing, I think, or at least implying, that the reason that they're trying to do that is because Donald Trump is Putin's guy. I'm not quite so sure about that. I think it's it's a possibility. I think what is perhaps more likely is that Donald Trump is expecting that if he delivers for Russia, that when he leaves the White House, he'll be able to become a real billionaire by having the biggest building in Moscow, the Trump Tower. Or that he's being blackmailed, or whatever it may be. But, honestly, we don't know yet. And Mueller, and now increasingly it looks like even things like Donald Trump in his testimony to Robert Mueller, in his written testimony to Robert Mueller, under oath, grand jury testimony, said that his campaign had no conversations with WikiLeaks, with Julian Assange. It's increasingly looking like that might be a lie, that might be a crime, that might be a point of collusion with WikiLeaks to take this information that was stolen by Russia and publicize it the day that the Access Hollywood tape came out. So, you've got the whole Russia thing, which now they're trying to discredit. They're trying to say, no, Trump isn't in the White House because of Russia. Trump is in the White House because he's just such a wonderful guy. Just like he had the biggest crowd ever. So we've got these two things happening at the same time. And on the back end, in both cases, the Trump White House is stalling or stonewalling, trying to, this is a massive cover-up right in front of our eyes. Stonewalling these attempts to investigate. And Pompeo came out today and said that State Department, because the Foreign Affairs Committee has now subpoenaed some people from the State Department. What's the State Department doing with all this stuff? And, you've got Rudy Giuliani running around going, yeah, but I wasn't there, as a private lawyer, and I wasn't there as Trump's lawyer. I was there because the State Department asked me to be there, et cetera, et cetera. All this stuff going on, and it's like, whoa. This has to be the most corrupt administration in the history of the United States. And the reason why is fairly obvious, in my opinion. In 1976, the U.S. Supreme Court, and I lay this out in my book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, which is on sale today. In 1976, the U.S. Supreme Court said in the Buckley versus Vallejo decision that and by the way, for the first time in the history, that if a billionaire or a very wealthy person wants to have their very own politician, if they want to own a politician, or if they want to fund a giant campaign to get legislation passed that will benefit them, the use of money to make that happen is free speech and is protected by the First Amendment. Now, we had never before said this. In the past, we always said that's corruption. That's bribery. That's corruption of the political process with money. But the Supreme Court came out and said, no, it's all fine. And then 2 years later, in the First National Bank versus Bellotti decision, they said, and by the way, that's true of corporations too. Corporations can own politicians. That was 78, which brought a ton of money into the federal campaigns in 79 and 1980, which put Ronald Reagan in the White House. Ronald Reagan was corrupt. His administration was corrupt. His vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, became president in 88, 89, he was sworn in. And he picked as his attorney general a guy by the name of Bill Barr. And as George Herbert Walker Bush was about to be prosecuted, his diary, his private diaries, which had the evidence that would have nailed both him and Reagan. I mean, both of them could have literally ended up in federal prison if these charges were proven true. His diary had that evidence, and Lawrence Walsh, the special prosecutor, had subpoenaed his diary, and President Bush, the elder, turns to his attorney general, Bill Barr, and says, what do I do? This is on page 118 of my book. And the next 5 pages after that lays out the whole thing. He says, what do I do? And Bill Barr says, pardon all the witnesses so they don't have to testify. And it'll shut down Lawrence Walsh's investigation. That'll be the end of the Iran-Contra investigation. And in fact, Barr bragged about this in 2001. On the record. And he did it. George Bush did it. He pardoned Ollie North, and he pardoned Elliott Abrams, and he pardoned Caspar Weinberger, and he pardoned a bunch of other people. And it was the Christmas Eve massacre of 1992. If you have a New York Times subscription, go look at the front page of the New York Times from December 24th, 1992. Screaming, all caps, 3-line headline in the New York Times. In fact, let me get the exact headline and read to you. But this is where it started. And this is, and this is where, this is how, this set up Donald Trump. This was the headline in the New York Times. Bush pardons 6 in Iran affair, aborting a Weinberger trial. Prosecutor assails cover-up. And that was the beginning of it. Bill Barr playing consigliere to the Bush family there. And now Trump has brought him in to do the same thing, and he's doing the same thing again. He's covering up for Trump their involvement with Russia, their involvement with other corrupt billionaires all around the world. I don't think that this is just all about Russia, frankly. I think this is about oligarchy. Hey, the billionaires get together. Hey, wouldn't it be cool to have a billionaire in the White House? Well, there you go. The mistake that they made, and Kurt Eichenwald pointed this out in the first hour on this program when he was here in the studio with us, the New York Times and Newsweek reporter. The mistake that they made was thinking that Donald Trump could be controlled, that, like George W. Bush, that he would basically maintain the pretense. Oh, the Republican Party is a legitimate political entity, and we're actually interested in governing and doing the right thing here in America, keeping America safe and all that. Well, while George W. Bush was doing 2 illegal wars and handing over $3 trillion, $3,000 billion to corrupt war profiteers to the military-industrial complex here in the United States, making the zip codes around Washington, D.C., the suburbs of Virginia, where these multi-million-dollar mansions with the attached servants' quarter or the detached servants' quarters and 100-room mansions and stuff, making that the richest zip code in America. Used to be Beverly Hills, movie stars. No, now it's defense contractors. I mean, that kind of corruption, they used to do it with this veneer of civility. And now Donald Trump is doing it just right out in the open, and he's pursuing these crazed right-wing conspiracy theories. And that's where it's going off the rails. And frankly, the Murdoch family and Fox News are driving the bus. We'll be back. It's 18 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
He's trying to find the whistleblower's identity. Natasha Bertrand is saying he's known it for several weeks. I think he's trying to whip up his followers to track this guy down and do something. And welcome back. And Connie in Reno, Nevada. Hey, Connie, what's on your mind today?
I just wanted to say I disagree with you on wanting to put them all in jail, because as much as I'd love to see that happen, I just don't think we have the power or the money to get through that. And I think at this point would be better off cutting a deal and just get rid of these people and get back to the business of saving this country. And
well, that's what we thought. That's what we thought in 1974 when Jerry Ford, stepped in and pardoned Nixon and basically put everything under seal for the next 50 years. That's what LBJ thought. When he put under seal Nixon's treason. At some point, go ahead.
Even if we get to that point, they're not going to go to Lompoc. They're not going to go to Attica. They're going to go to some country club place for 14 days, like Felicity Huffman. Yeah. Unlike the lady who in Texas who put down a different address to get her daughter in a better school district, she's doing real prison time now. Yeah. So we're not going to get our revenge on these people. But we can do is get rid of them and move forward. And I think that needs to be our focus.
Yeah. So, it's worthy of discussion, Connie, whether we, if Trump comes forward and says to the Democrats, basically, although probably he'd have to say it to the Republicans as well, it would have to be a bipartisan thing. If he says, okay, let me go back to New York and go back to being a corrupt, New York real estate grifter, and don't prosecute me, don't prosecute Jared, let him keep that $1 billion that he got from Qatar, don't prosecute Ivanka, let her keep her trademarks that she got from China. And, don't prosecute the boys, Don Jr. and Eric. Just, let them continue doing the stuff that they're doing. And let Don Jr. run for the Senate, which Don Jr. thinks he's got a grand political future and he's going to be the next Trump. And I'm not even speculating about that, Connie. I mean, in Republican circles, they're talking about Don Jr. running for Senate in New York.
Really?
Honest to God. And so, so if Trump comes forward and says, well, just let us all, go back to normal and we'll let you have your country back, you're saying we should say, fine. And
yeah, because they're not going back to normal after this.
There
is no normal for those people after this. They're still going to be rich and they're still going to, but like I say, we're not going to get our vengeance. We don't have the money or the power.
I'm not looking for vengeance. I am looking for justice.
And fund us. Yeah, I'd love to see justice. But unless Oprah wants to step in and help fund us on this, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah, it's going to take a lot more money than Oprah has.
Yeah. But hey, thanks for everything. Appreciate it, Tom.
Thank you, Connie. I mean, this is going to be, I think, the next big debate. Because if this impeachment thing really picks up steam, and it looks to me like it already is, and it is for good reason, if it already is, the big question will be, because Trump is a deal maker, right? I mean, that's what he does. He's going to come forward. This is how he got out of, being $1 billion underwater with all his various scams and deals and casinos and stuff, is he declared bankruptcy 6 times, which is kind of the same thing. Give me a get out of jail free card. He's gonna ask for a get out of jail free card for himself and for the entire Trump crime family. And Paul Manafort doesn't realize it, but Trump is probably going to let him continue to rot in jail. And Michael Cohen will be out in 2 years, and boy, is it going to get interesting. But should we cut a deal with him or not? We'll be back. It's 22 minutes past the hour. So every 5 years, the U.S. Department of Agriculture comes out with new guidelines, and we just put up a video over at ThomHartmann.com for supporters of our program that talks about how the Trump administration, in this insanely corrupt deal with the $100 billion industry of ultra-processed, high-sugar, high-salt, high-fat foods that is literally killing 700,000 Americans a year, has said, oh, we're going to change the guidelines so that these fast food, high processed food companies can shovel their stuff into our school lunch programs, into our kids. We're going to change the guidelines so people aren't informed about the importance of, dialing back somewhat on meat and on salt and sugar and all these other things. It's nuts. You can check the whole thing out over at thomhartmann.com. Look for the video for our, the supporters of our program at thomhartmann.com. Hi, Thom Hartmann here with you. And just a reminder, at the bottom of the hour, at 32 minutes past the hour, in fact, we're going to have the director of this new movie, Where's My Roy Cohn? He's going to drop in and fill us in on that, and then we'll get back to your phone calls. Ken in Olympia, Washington. Hey, Ken, what's on your mind today?
I'm a bit confused. I'm hoping you can help me. I read today that Pompeo says that he's not going to let the State Department officials respond to the disposition.
To the subpoenas,
and I know in the past, other Republicans said they will not respond to subpoenas.
Right.
So what are the real-world consequences when they don't follow these?
Well, the Congress can declare them in contempt. If they declare them in civil contempt, there's three kinds of contempt. If they declare them in civil contempt, then it goes to the courts. Now, when Nixon said, I'm not going to turn over the tapes, they charged Nixon with contempt, and they went to the Supreme Court immediately. And because it was an impeachment hearing, and the Supreme Court said, no, you've got to turn over the tapes. So it's possible that this could even go directly to the Supreme Court if the Democrats frame it as part of the impeachment hearings. And who knows what the Supreme Court is going to do, because we've got, 5 right-wing partisans on the court. That's number one. Number two, they could declare criminal contempt and say, no, we're going to try and throw you in jail. If they declare criminal contempt, then they have to refer that charge to the Attorney General, Bill Barr. So I'm not holding my breath on that one. Or number three, they could declare inherent contempt, which they have not done since the 1920s, if my recollection is correct, maybe the 1930s, for a long time, for nearly 100 years. It used to be fairly routine in the 1800s, but it hasn't been done since the early 1900s. And under inherent contempt, they can order the sergeant at arms, basically, the Capitol Police, to grab these guys and stick them in a room in the Capitol building. Now, they have used in the past, they've used conference rooms, they've used meeting rooms, and they have a room in the basement that was sort of the old jail, but right now it's where they store the carriage that carried Abraham Lincoln's body. So they're not really prepared for that, for inherent contempt, and that would be immediately appealed to the Supreme Court anyway. So I'm not sure what they'll be able to do, Ken. That's the problem. The power of police is held in the executive branch, in the president, in the president, Bill Barr, and the State Department and whatnot. So, what we have here is a first-class constitutional crisis in the making. And, we'll see where it goes. But those are the options as far as I understand it. Ken, thanks a lot for the call. We'll be back. We're going to dig into Where's My Roy Cohn, and what does that have to do with Donald Trump? Boy, is this going to blow your mind. And then we'll get back to your phone calls as well. So stick around. It's coming up on 28 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, live from Portland, Oregon. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with the new movie, Where's My Roy Cohn, or at least the director of said movie, in just a few minutes. Our selection today for the Thom Hartmann Book Club is This Land, How Cowboys, Capitalism, and Corruption Are Ruining the American West by Christopher Ketchum. This is from Chapter 1. It's about halfway through the chapter. He's talking about Bernard DeVoto. DeVoto was the first major historian of the West who was also an environmentalist and an activist, the first chronicler of what Wallace Stenger called the West's curious desire to rape itself. DeVoto was a Westerner raised in Utah. He suffered in the provincialism and intolerance of Mormon country, went east to study and then teach at Harvard, settled in Cambridge, but never forgot the beauty of his native ground. Loving the land and history, said a magazine profile, but loathing the society. His histories, novels, criticism, his essays in Harper's Magazine where for 20 years he wrote the oldest column in American journalism, Easy Chair, pointed always west. His trilogy, published in the 1940s, The Year of Decision, Across the Wide Missouri, and The Course of Empire, garnered the Pulitzer, the Bancroft, and the National Book Award. Widely celebrated, DeVoto used his position to become his generation's most outspoken defender of the public lands. He called the West a plundered province, a resource colony for corporations and absentee landlords who practiced, quote, an economy of liquidation. He was broad in his assault on the liquidators. He went after the timbermen, the mining companies, the stockmen, the cattle barons, the oilmen and gasmen, the overgrazers, the deforesters, the denuders, the profiteers of gold rushes and grass rushes. He named the bankers and congressmen who abetted the plundering, the Western hogs, he called them. They've been busy for a century laying waste to the West. Long before the public domain was vested with any permanence legally in the hands of the American people, before there was a consideration of the land itself or any environmental ethic, the West had been torn up, beaten down, subjected to the greed and profligacy of the commodity users. Ironically, the users, in their race to liquidate, helped drive the creation of the public land system we know today, as they proved the need for federal stewardship to stop their abuses. Massive timber frauds in the 19th century, the largest land frauds seen in the West, led directly to the establishment of the Forest Service in the 20th century, its purpose to stop deforestation. Out-of-control cattle numbers in the steppe, overgrazing that turned the fragile soil to dust, led directly to the federal grazing regulatory system that eventually became the BLM. When in 1946 the commodity users conspired to destroy the public land system, the system in which DeVoto saw the only hope for Western conservation and preservation, he stood to oppose them. Quote, he was the first conservationist in nearly half a century, except for Franklin D. Roosevelt, to command a national audience, said Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a student of his at Harvard. No one did more in the post-war years to rouse public opinion against the spoilers than DeVoto. DeVoto and Schlesinger had seen firsthand what unregulated industry could wreak in the arid lands when they drove cross-country together in the spring of 1940 and entered western Kansas past the 100th meridian. These were the last years of the Dust Bowl before FDR's soil conservation programs and the return rains of the 40s could heal the land. Wrote DeVoto, a cemetery was 10 inches deep in sand. Half the headstones had toppled into it and been partly covered. Sagging shacks that had been farmhouses had their windows blown out and dust was 2 or 4 or 6 feet deep against their western walls and a foot deep against the far wall. A repulsive dust as fine as sifted flour. Now, 6 years after that trip with Schlesinger, DeVoto was confronted with the West's cattle barons, the liquidators of the grass, who were hell-bent on reducing the region to the same mess of dust. In 1946, the Joint Committee on Public Lands of the American National Livestock Association met in Salt Lake City to discuss the goal of undermining what few regulations had been placed on livestock operators under the newly formed Bureau of Land Management. The stock growers' ambition went further than mere deregulation. They hatched a plan with the help of friends in Congress to begin moving all federal land, the BLM and Forest Service domain, as well as the national parks, into the control of the states. The plan evolved through 1946, 47, 48, with legislation making its way on Capitol Hill. DeVoto covered the story for Harper's. He cautioned that the stock growers were attempting, quote, one of the biggest land grabs in American history. The public lands are first to be transferred to the states on the wholly justified assumption that there should be a state government not wholly compliant to the desires of stock growers. It could be pressured into compliance, he wrote in Harper's. Nothing in history suggests the states are adequate to protect their own resources or even want to, or suggests that cattlemen and sheepmen are capable of regulating themselves even for their own benefit, still less the public's, end quote. The long-term plan, he said, was to get rid of the public lands altogether, to place the common possession of the American people into private hands. The livestock industry went on the attack, mounted a PR campaign to discredit DeVoto, and pressured Harper's to cease its support. Unmoved, the magazine continued for 3 years to publish his relentless exposés of the intrigues in the state houses and in the Western Caucus. DeVoto had convinced the editors, when no other publication that mattered in the East cared, that the threat of such land transfer was an existential one. This Land by Christopher. Thom Hartmann Cruise will be sailing in July of 2020. The 7-day Oceania cruise will be going to Bermuda, and I'll be hosting onboard events about the topics of the day. More info at thomhartmann.com or 800-856-1155. Here with you, and I believe that we have Matt Tyrnauer on the line. Matt, are you there?
Yeah. Hi, how are you?
Hey, Matt. Fine, although it sounds like you're on a speakerphone. If you could pick up the phone, I'd appreciate it. Matt is the director of Where's My Roy Cohn, which is an extraordinary new movie that Louise and I watched a preview of earlier in the week and was just mind-boggling. Matt, give us a summary of this movie.
Well, Roy Cohn is the link between Joseph McCarthy and Donald Trump. He was a very, very influential power broker and one of the great kind of dark schemers and sort of mobbed up power figures of mid-century.
And how has Donald Trump been informed by his association with Roy Cohn?
He is fully the creation of Roy Cohn. And they met in the 70s, and Cohn mentored Trump. And I think people who I interviewed who knew them at the time said that Donald Trump is Roy Cohn, basically.
Wow. So when is the movie coming out, and where is the movie coming out? How can people find it?
The movie came out last week. It's in theaters, and it's going across the country right now.
So check your local listings.
Absolutely.
Do you have a website for it?
RoyCohnMovie.com.
Roy Cohn, and that's C-O-H-N. RoyCohnMovie.com. Thank you very much for that. And Matt, what should we do? As I mentioned, Louise and I watched the movie, and first of all, it's a mind-boggling biography of Roy Cohn from Army McCarthy days, from actually putting to death Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, right through this insanely corrupt career of his, and his association with Donald Trump as well. What can we do with this information? What should Americans, how should we respond to knowing this?
The reason I made the movie is to show what self-interested power can do. Mm-hmm. Cohn was a very influential lawyer at a very young age. In his early 20s, he was the prosecutor in the Julius and Ethel Rosenberg spy case. And then J. Edgar Hoover put him at the side of McCarthy, and he really was one of the key figures in the McCarthy witch hunt era. And what he symbolized and what he fomented in U.S. government of the period was the politics of self-interest and demagoguery. And McCarthy was the greatest example of that in our modern history until Trump. So it so happens that there's a direct link between McCarthy and Trump, and that is in the form of Roy Cohn. And what does Trump do? And, by the way, Joseph McCarthy never came close to the presidency. That Trump ascended to the presidency through the quirk of the Electoral College is a horrific reality. But the self-interested politics of Roy Cohn are embodied by Donald Trump. So the McCarthy era, which is was our darkest modern political moment, if you don't count Watergate, I suppose, is back with us. And Roy Cohn really was the creature who was the architect of both of these moments, because he was the person who taught Trump everything he knows.
In your movie, you point out that when Donald Trump and his dad, when Donald was working for his dad, Fred was still alive and running his little real estate empire, they had been sued by the federal government for refusing to rent housing units to black people, to African Americans. And Trump turned to Roy Cohn and said, "What do we do?" And Roy Cohn said, "Fight them." And they launched this massive battle against the federal government, which essentially ended up in a tie. A, you want to fill that in a little bit, and B, how does that inform us about what we should expect from Trump going forward? Newsweek yesterday was reporting that that there are some reports coming out of the White House that some of Trump's people have been trying to negotiate, basically, and nobody's sure who they're negotiating with, but that there's discussion in the White House about Trump cutting a deal where all federal and state prosecutions against him drop. No members of his family will ever be prosecuted. Just let them go back to being New York real estate grifters, and we'll give you back your country. And some people have called into the program today saying, oh, "Wait a minute, if you don't nail this guy, the next guy's going to be even worse." But how does that deal that Trump, where he got busted for discrimination, how does that inform how he's behaving now, and what should that tell us about what we might expect?
Yes, well, I think, again, one of the reasons I made the movie is if you look at the Roy Cohn playbook, you'll understand and almost have a crystal ball into the way Trump's going to behave. What you just outlined about this kind of backroom bargaining that's going on to cut deals is exactly out of the Cohn playbook. The other principle of Cohn is when you are in a flaming defeat, claim victory, and then figure out another way to confuse the conversation and throw out misinformation and basically demagogue the issue. Going back to the kind of meet-cute moment of Cohn and Trump in the 70s around a housing discrimination suit that the Justice Department had brought against Donald Trump and his father, Fred Trump. This has been widely reported. It's one of the more appalling things in Trump's racist past. They were at the Trump Organization denying apartments to people of color. When they would go in to meet with rental agents, they would mark the application with a C for colored, and then they would basically throw it out or throw it in the bottom drawer. The Justice Department rightfully went after them. Trump engaged Roy Cohn to defend him and his father, and Cohn did a brilliant thing using his bare-knuckle kind of mob lawyer tactics. He told them to countersue the Justice Department for $100 million. Absurd. The counterclaim was dismissed, of course, but it threw the opponent off balance. And eventually there was a settlement with no admission of guilt, which Trump has paraded out over the decades, saying that there was no admission of guilt. He claimed victory for what was a defeat, but Cohn had done a good job of defending him by using these bully mob attorney tactics, which Trump has adopted and deployed ever since. You see it in the events of last week. All of these diversionary tactics, throwing Mike Pence under the bus, moving toward throwing Giuliani and Barr under the bus if necessary. I would predict that you're going to see that. As Trump becomes more cornered, he'll try to sacrifice everyone around him until he's the last man standing.
Wow. Yeah, it's pretty impressive stuff. And the movie is Where's My Roy Cohn? It is in theaters all across the United States right now. Check your local listings. And if it's not in a theater near you, call them up and ask them when it's coming. And Matt Tyrnauer, am I saying your name right, Matt?
You got it. Thank you.
Matt, thanks so much for dropping by today. It's great talking with you. It was an amazing movie to watch. I strongly, highly, emphatically recommend it to everybody, and I wish you the very best. Thanks a lot, Matt.
Thank you.
Great talking with you. We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a few minutes. It's 43 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. Stick around.
listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back with your calls in just a moment. Stick around. And welcome back. Rob in California. Hey, Rob, what's up? Where in California?
Hey, I'm from the Inland Empire, but I'm in Newport Beach right now.
Okay, so what's up?
So I wanted to talk about Mitt Romney and his white horse theories and how he might try and lead the Republicans against Trump.
Oh, count on it. The white horse prophecy for Pete. Well, do you want to summarize it in a couple of sentences, or you want me to?
You go ahead, but I'd like to bring up like the Utah war and a little bit of that stuff afterwards.
Sure. Yeah. Well, this prophecy is an interpretation of the Book of Mormon, which is not universally subscribed to, but is a big deal among some Mormons. That what's going to bring back Jesus, what's going to turn the world around, is when a Mormon becomes president. And that Mormon then, will basically be the white horse, of Revelation's lore, who saves the country. Back to you, Rob.
Well, so I think that Donald Trump is going to allow everybody except one of his sons. One of his sons, is going to be convicted for felony tampering. Then it's going to run in Florida. See, people are saying New York, but I think it's going to be Florida. That's why they're holding up the felony laws that allow voters there. And they know they already have that state on all levels.
But they got Ron DeSantis. He's probably the most corrupt governor in the United States, and he's...
Oh, yeah.
He's a firewall against that, is he not?
Yeah, and they have every single level in Florida that they can jam in there.
They have a supermajority in the House.
Yeah, and you talked about how older people were donating their life savings. That's all of Florida.
Yeah.
But I think that the billionaire class of Mitt Romney and the ones that have real actual religious views behind them, I think they're going to rally. They have to know that if they don't get in now and they don't fight against Trump now, they're never going to have their shot.
Right.
Like Romney knows he can't be the white horse if Trump is president for the next 8-10 years.
Right.
Until violence happens.
Right. So, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me, Rob, and I've been watching Romney on this, and I think that he's, in his careful way, he is positioning himself to be the guy who's going to save us from Trump. I absolutely agree with you. Thanks a lot for the call. Patty in Stamford, Connecticut. Hey, Patty, what's up?
Hi. I was just wondering if somehow they prove that Trump is illegitimate. Don't ask me how, but if there's a tape with, Putin saying he did it and, bribing.
It's going to be more likely him and WikiLeaks. But anyhow, if that happens, what?
And if that happens, then, as I understand it, all his appointments to the justices would be null and void.
No, there's no provision for that in the Constitution. I mean, I wish, and not just the Supreme Court. It would be nice to reverse a lot of it,
I've heard that. I've heard that, but
from whom and what's the rationale? Yeah, see, it's just not the case. I mean, there's no law, there's no case law for that. Some states may have provisions in their constitutions for that, but we don't at the federal level. So I think we're stuck with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. I would like to know, and thank you for the call, Patty, I would like to know why Justice Anthony Kennedy resigned when he did, just as his son was involved in the Deutsche Bank Trump scandal. So every 5 years, the U.S. Department of Agriculture comes out with new guidelines, and we just put up a video over at ThomHartmann.com for supporters of our program that talks about how the Trump administration, in this insanely corrupt deal with the $100 billion industry of ultra-processed, high sugar, high salt, high fat foods that is literally killing 700,000 Americans a year, has said, oh, we're going to change the guidelines so that these fast food, high processed food companies can shovel their stuff into our school lunch programs, into our kids. We're going to change the guidelines so people aren't informed about the importance of, dialing back somewhat on meat and on salt and sugar and all these other things. It's nuts. You can check the whole thing out over at thomhartmann.com. Look for the video for our, the supporters of our program at thomhartmann.com. Welcome back. We're kind of wrapping up the show here and discussing what might happen. What might happen if Donald Trump comes and says, hey, let's make a deal? Stephen in Oakland, California. Hey, thanks for listening to AM 910. What's up, Stephen?
Yeah, Tom, the end deal there, I was thinking that he needs to settle the score. Maybe he's doing that now. He goes back, settles the score.
What does that mean?
He has to face Nancy Pelosi, okay, which is like his mother, Mary Trump. Mary Trump put him in exile. She's the only one that stepped up to that and put him in boarding school, wherever it was.
Yeah, in a military academy. Yeah, it was a boarding school. And when he came home during the summer, she went to Scotland without him.
Yes.
So you think that Nancy Pelosi, Nancy Pelosi's actually older than Donald Trump? I think she's 79 now, which is amazing given the energy and and how just crisp she is. But she probably is that mother figure. I think that, we could probably do a lot with Mr. Freud's theories on this, Stephen. Yeah.
Yes. Also, Tom,
yeah.
Now, with the deal being cut, he should be in exile. I mean, he's going to have to face her. That's why he treats her with kid gloves. I do believe, like we talked before, he will go to Moscow. But don't let the kids free. You can't let them run around America like he did, okay?
Yeah.
There's got to be, somebody's got to put a stop to this. New York, he should have been in Otisville 10 years ago. So New York, you slept on this one. City doesn't sleep, police.
Yeah.
I'm from Massachusetts. And also, too, Donald Trump, for the worst thing that ever happened to a president, does he remember JFK? Come on. Let's get him.
No, let's not get him, and let's not do it like JFK, Stephen. I'm sorry. There is no way. And even thinking like that, I mean, please don't come back on this program, Stephen. Gene in Cochise, Arizona. Gene, what's on your mind?
Hi, I'm old enough to remember Nixon. Nixon is the first president I voted for, and I applauded his impeachment. I've been through this so many times with so many presidents, and every time somebody says, "Just let them go. Don't indict them for their corruption," say, "No, that's what got us in this mess." They know they're going to just get out of jail free.
Right.
They're going to get pardoned by the Democrats who never stand up to anybody. They'll just pardon them because they don't want to deal with it.
Well, the thing where Trump may have gone a bit far is he is now trying to basically impeach the Obama administration. He's going back, this retroactive classification by Pompeo of Hillary's emails and all this stuff. They're going after Clinton. And they're going back. And the Democrats have always refused to do that. They, when Jerry Ford pardoned Nixon, it was like, okay, that's good. And then, when Bill Barr got George Herbert Walker Bush to pardon Caspar Weinberger and Elliott Abrams and Ollie North and company, the Democrats were like, okay, cool. And when George W. Bush and Dick Cheney left office, having committed massive war crimes, lied America into a multi-trillion-dollar war that cost us thousands of dead Americans and hundreds of thousands of dead Iraqis and Afghanis. The Democrats said, okay, cool. Well, we're going to look forward, not backward, was President Obama's phrase. I don't think we can do that anymore.
Wait. The Democrats always say that we can't bring retribution against the previous administration because they'll do it to us. And then the Republicans do it anyway. Yeah, exactly. My point. And I think that we have crossed the Rubicon here, Gene. Thank you for the call. Susan in Phoenix, Arizona. Hey, Susan, what's up?
Hi. Hey, thanks. I loved your book on guns.
Thank you.
But what I'd like to point out is my concern is if he's just let go to go back to New York with no crimes or held accountable, he could start his civil war. I think they need to worry about how he puts himself out in the public again like he did to President Obama.
Yeah, this is a concern.
And all
Now
of them.
you've got one of these right-wing groups, the Oath Keepers, out there saying, we're ready for a civil war. We've got the guns. I mean, that's pretty spooky stuff.
And I think he could rile them up to start it. That's my concern.
Yeah, this is
But
something.
then you got,
Go ahead.
and then you also have Mnuchin, who should have been held accountable for his crimes, and now he's the head of our Treasury.
Yeah.
They need to be held accountable. I think this has gone too far through history.
Yeah, Mnuchin was, for people who don't realize, he was called the foreclosure king in California. He foreclosed on thousands and thousands of people illegally with robo-signed, stuff. And the Attorney General of California at the time, Kamala Harris, had an opportunity to prosecute him and decided not to. And boom, now he's in the White House. That should be a cautionary tale for all of us. Susan, thank you for the call. Rocco in Illinois. Hey, Rocco, what's up?
Hey, you were talking about Trump's relationship with Putin. And, I truly believe that, the Italian mob is gone. Okay, and ironically, Rudy Giuliani, was one of the main prosecutors of the Italian mob. But we got the Russian mob in New York, okay, and very powerful. And you know who the head of the Russian mob is?
No.
Vladimir Putin.
Oh.
These guys are all known with Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, and a bunch of oligarchs. And I think, as I said earlier, I think this goes beyond Russia. I think that you've got a whole bunch of oligarchs from some of the Stan countries and from Ukraine and from Russia and, frankly, from the Philippines and from India. And, I think that what we're seeing right now, Rocco, is not, Putin and Russia taking over the world. I think it's oligarchs, billionaires, including American oligarchs, American billionaires, basically taking over the political systems of most of the Western democracies. And I've got an op-ed that will be published tomorrow about this very issue. Yeah. Rocco, thanks for the call. Dreas in Escondido, California. Hey, Dreas, what's up?
Hey, Tom, what's going on? Just wanted to say, because you said it a couple times about this a global thing going on. The book Giants, The Global Power Elite by Peter Phillips really goes into how this is a transnational, transglobal capitalism issue. But the point I wanted to see if you would clarify for me, because I'm not sure if you know Jimmy Dore Show. Has about almost 700,000 subscribers on YouTube. He's progressive left, but he's like a different progressive left because he thinks the Mueller report is bullshit. And
I'm sorry, you can't use words like that, Dreas.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
I've got to drop you. And my apologies if that slipped through to anybody. Oh, you dumped him? Okay, thank you, Sean. So anyhow, this is where we're at, right? This is our new reality. We've got an attorney general who's trying to prove that what was uncovered by Robert Mueller, that we had a foreign government or agents of a foreign government or people who are hanging out with a foreign government interfere in our election. He's trying to disprove that. He's trying to get the Prime Minister of Australia and major politicians in Italy and Macedonia and Spain and Greece to go along with this. At the same time that we are actually the Secretary of State now is on this too. At the same time that they're trying to say, oh no, Trump didn't actually engage in attempted bribery with the president of Ukraine. It's insane. We'll see where this all goes, but I'm telling you, this is like nothing we've ever seen in our lifetimes. And if it's not handled well, if it's not handled carefully, it's not going to end well for any of us, for this country. I'm very concerned about the fate and future of my nation right now. Anyhow, it's a good time to get involved. So get out there, get active, tag You're It. We'll see you tomorrow. Same time, same place. Have a great afternoon.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
We say fight back!
Bye.